My name is Clara Sterling. I am 31 years old and a senior corporate auditor. I spent my entire life trying to earn my family's love by being the perfect quiet servant. But when I accidentally spilled wine at our Christmas dinner, my mother slapped me across the face so hard, the entire room went dead silent. She screamed that I was blind and that I ruined everything I touched. I held my burning cheek, looked at their cold faces, and finally woke up. The next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, I left a small package on their front porch. What they found inside did not just ruin their holiday. It completely destroyed the fake wealthy lives they had built behind my back. Before I tell you what was in that box, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe that toxic family members need to face the consequences of their actions. Also drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from today and what time it is there. I love reading your comments. Now let me take you to that dining room where everything changed. The sound of shattering crystal hung heavily in the air. The delicate wine glass had hit the hardwood floor, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the expensive rug. But the crash of the glass was absolutely nothing compared to the sharp, stinging fire that was currently spreading across my left cheek. I stood there completely frozen. My hand slowly lifted, my fingers pressing against the burning skin where my mother Patricia had just struck me. The slap had been so forceful that my ears were actually ringing. Patricia towered over me, her chest heaving, her face twisted with a kind of vicious rage, usually reserved for bitter enemies, not for her own daughter. "Are you entirely blind?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the formal dining room. "Look at what you have done. You ruin absolutely everything you touch. You are incredibly clumsy." I did not say a word. I just kept my hand pressed against my face and let my eyes sweep across the dining table. It was a beautiful table, perfectly set for Christmas dinner. I knew it was perfect, because I was the one who had spent the last 8 hours preparing it. I had polished the heavy silver forks and knives until my fingers physically ached. I had roasted the massive turkey sitting in the center of the table, basting it every 30 minutes while the rest of my family sat in the living room drinking cocktails and laughing without me. I had prepared the mashed potatoes, the green bean casserole, the homemade cranberry sauce. I had even purchased the expensive $200 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon with my own money, hoping that for once someone might just say thank you. Instead, that exact bottle of wine was now dripping from the edge of the mahogany table onto the floor. Despite cooking the entire meal and paying for most of the groceries, I was not seated at the main section of the table. I was relegated to a cheap folding chair pushed right up against the swinging kitchen door. It was drafty and cold, positioned perfectly so I could jump up and clear plates or fetch more ice like a hired maid. At the center of the table, occupying the best velvet upholstered chairs, sat my older sister Chloe and her husband Trevor Harrison. Chloe was 33 years old and the undeniable golden child of the Sterling family. She was currently looking down at her cream-colored silk dress where a few drops of the red wine had splashed. "Oh my God!" Chloe wailed, her voice thick with fake exaggerated sobbing. "This is a designer dress. It is completely ruined. Clara, why are you always so careless?" She dabbed at the tiny stain with a cloth napkin, looking around the table to make sure everyone was paying attention to her tragedy. Sitting next to her, Trevor just shook his head. He adjusted the heavy gold watch on his wrist, a watch he loved to show off, and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. He was 35, a man who called himself a real estate developer, but mostly just spent his time talking about his massive wealth and his upcoming New Year's Eve investor gala. He looked at me, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He was enjoying this. He had intentionally pushed his chair back right as I was reaching over to clear his empty salad plate, causing my arm to jerk and the wine glass to tip over. But nobody saw that. They only saw clumsy Clara making a mess just like they always did. Just 5 minutes before this happened, the mood had been entirely different. My father Richard had raised his glass to offer a toast. He had praised Trevor for his brilliant business mind. He had praised Chloe for being such a wonderful, supportive wife. He had looked at the two of them with tears of pride in his eyes and called them the absolute success stories of the Sterling family. I had not mentioned me once. I was the senior corporate auditor at a major firm. I worked 60-hour weeks. I paid my own bills and lived completely independently. Yet in this house I was practically invisible until I made a mistake. I looked away from Trevor's sickening smirk and turned my gaze to my father. Richard Sterling was sitting at the head of the table. He was 60 years old, a man who always prided himself on being the head of the household. But right now, he was staring intently at his plate of food. He picked up his fork and knife and carefully cut a piece of turkey. He chewed his food slowly. He did not look up. I did not defend me. He did not ask my mother why she had just assaulted their youngest daughter over a spilled drink. His silence was deafening. It was the same cowardly silence he had maintained for my entire life, always choosing to turn a blind eye while Patricia tore me down to build Chloe up. He was just as guilty as she was. The burning sensation on my cheek was starting to throb, pulsing in time with my racing heart. I looked at the four of them, my mother glaring at me with pure disgust, my sister performing a theatrical crying routine over a few drops of wine, my brother-in-law smiling at my humiliation, my father eating his dinner like nothing had happened. For 31 years, I had bent over backwards trying to earn a place at this table. I had paid for their vacations. I had cooked their holiday meals. I had accepted the insults, the subtle jabs, the drafty folding chair by the kitchen door, all because I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, they would eventually love me. But love does not look like this. Love does not hit you in the face. Love does not watch you get humiliated and continue eating turkey as if the person bleeding emotionally in front of them is completely worthless. The heat on my face seemed to burn away the thick fog of obligation and guilt that had clouded my vision for decades. I saw them clearly for the very first time. They were not a family. They were a group of bullies who kept me around simply because they needed a servant to abuse and a scapegoat to blame for their own miserable behavior. "Clara, clean this mess up right now," Patricia ordered, pointing her manicured finger at the spilled wine on the floor. "Get a towel and scrub the floor before it stains the wood. Move." I did not move immediately. I slowly lowered my hand from my cheek. I stood up perfectly straight, towering over my mother in my own way. I looked directly into her eyes, maintaining a cold, unblinking stare until she actually took a half step backward in surprise. I did not cry. I did not apologize. I did not offer to pay for Chloe's dress. The time for apologizing was officially over. I turned my back on the dining table and the people sitting around it. I walked out of the dining room, my heels making slow, deliberate sounds on the hardwood floor. I ignored my mother shouting my name. I ignored Chloe's whining. I needed a towel just like my mother had ordered, but I was not going to the kitchen. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward my father's home office. The room was dark and quiet, a sanctuary away from the madness of the dining table. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside completely unaware that in the next few seconds I was going to stumble upon a massive financial secret that would finally give me the power to tear this family apart. I always thought my biggest problem was being the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped my sister. But when I accidentally spilled a glass of wine at our Christmas dinner, my mother slapped me so hard, the entire room went dead silent. She screamed that I was blind and that I ruined everything I touched. I held my burning cheek, looked at their cold faces, and finally walked away. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I left a small package on their front porch. What they found inside did not just ruin their holiday, it completely destroyed the fake wealthy lives they had built behind my back. The sound of shattering crystal hung heavily in the air. The delicate wine glass had hit the hardwood floor, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the expensive rug. But the crash of the glass was absolutely nothing compared to the sharp, stinging fire that was currently spreading across my left cheek. I stood there completely frozen. My hand slowly lifted, my fingers pressing against the burning skin where my mother, Patricia, had just struck me. The slap had been so forceful that my ears were actually ringing. Patricia towered over me, her chest heaving, her face twisted with a kind of vicious rage, usually reserved for bitter enemies, not for her own daughter. "Are you entirely blind?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the formal dining room. "Look at what you have done. You ruin absolutely everything you touch. You are incredibly clumsy." I did not say a word. I just kept my hand pressed against my face and let my eyes sweep across the dining table. It was a beautiful table, perfectly set for Christmas dinner. I knew it was perfect because I was the one who had spent the last 8 hours preparing it. I had polished the heavy silver forks and knives until my fingers physically ached. I had roasted the massive turkey sitting in the center of the table, basting it every 30 minutes while the rest of my family sat in the living room drinking cocktails and laughing without me. I had prepared the mashed potatoes, the green bean casserole, the homemade cranberry sauce. I had even purchased the expensive $200 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon with my own money, hoping that for once someone might just say thank you. Instead, that exact bottle of wine was now dripping from the edge of the mahogany table onto the floor. Despite cooking the entire meal and paying for most of the groceries, I was not seated at the main section of the table. I was relegated to a cheap folding chair pushed right up against the swinging kitchen door. It was drafty and cold positioned perfectly, so I could jump up and clear plates or fetch more ice like a hired maid. At the center of the table, occupying the best velvet upholstered chairs, sat my older sister Chloe and her husband Trevor Harrison. Chloe was 33 years old and the undeniable golden child of the Sterling family. She was currently looking down at her cream-colored silk dress, where a few drops of the red wine had splashed. "Oh my God," Chloe wailed, her voice thick with fake exaggerated sobbing. "This is a designer dress. It is completely ruined. Clara, why are you always so careless?" She dabbed at the tiny stain with a cloth napkin, looking around the table to make sure everyone was paying attention to her tragedy. Sitting next to her, Trevor just shook his head. He adjusted the heavy gold watch on his wrist, a watch he loved to show off, and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. He was 35, a man who called himself a real estate developer, but mostly just spent his time talking about his massive wealth and his upcoming New Year's Eve investor gala. He looked at me, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He was enjoying this. He had intentionally pushed his chair back right as I was reaching over to clear his empty salad plate, causing my arm to jerk and the wine glass to tip over. But nobody saw that. They only saw clumsy Clara making a mess just like they always did. Just 5 minutes before this happened, the mood had been entirely different. My father, Richard, had raised his glass to offer a toast. He had praised Trevor for his brilliant business mind. He had praised Chloe for being such a wonderful, supportive wife. He had looked at the two of them with tears of pride in his eyes and called them the absolute success stories of the Sterling family. I had not mentioned me once. I was a senior corporate auditor at a major firm. I worked 60-hour weeks. I paid my own bills and lived completely independently. Yet in this house I was practically invisible until I made a mistake. I looked away from Trevor's sickening smirk and turned my gaze to my father. Richard Sterling was sitting at the head of the table. He was 60 years old, a man who always prided himself on being the head of the household. But right now, he was staring intently at his plate of food. He picked up his fork and knife and carefully cut a piece of turkey. He chewed his food slowly. He did not look up. He did not defend me. He did not ask my mother why she had just assaulted their youngest daughter over a spilled drink. His silence was deafening. It was the same cowardly silence he had maintained for my entire life, always choosing to turn a blind eye while Patricia tore me down to build Chloe up. He was just as guilty as she was. The burning sensation on my cheek was starting to throb, pulsing in time with my racing heart. I looked at the four of them, my mother glaring at me with pure disgust, my sister performing a theatrical crying routine over a few drops of wine, my brother-in-law smiling at my humiliation, my father eating his dinner like nothing had happened. For 31 years, I had bent over backwards trying to earn a place at this table. I had paid for their vacations. I had cooked their holiday meals. I had accepted the insults, the subtle jabs, the drafty folding chair by the kitchen door, all because I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, they would eventually love me. But love does not look like this. Love does not hit you in the face. Love does not watch you get humiliated and continue eating turkey as if the person bleeding emotionally in front of them is completely worthless. The heat on my face seemed to burn away the thick fog of obligation and guilt that had clouded my vision for decades. I saw them clearly for the very first time. They were not a family. They were a group of bullies who kept me around simply because they needed a servant to abuse and a scapegoat to blame for their own miserable behavior. "Clara, clean this mess up right now," Patricia ordered, pointing her manicured finger at the spilled wine on the floor. "Get a towel and scrub the floor before it stains the wood. Move." I did not move immediately. I slowly lowered my hand from my cheek. I stood up perfectly straight, towering over my mother in my own way. I looked directly into her eyes, maintaining a cold, unblinking stare until she actually took a half step backward in surprise. I did not cry. I did not apologize. I did not offer to pay for Chloe's dress. The time for apologizing was officially over. I turned my back on the dining table and the people sitting around it. I walked out of the dining room, my heels making slow, deliberate sounds on the hardwood floor. I ignored my mother shouting my name. I ignored Chloe's whining. I needed a towel, just like my mother had ordered, but I was not going to the kitchen. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward my father's home office. The room was dark and quiet, a sanctuary away from the madness of the dining table. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside, completely unaware that in the next few seconds I was going to stumble upon a massive financial secret that would finally give me the power to tear this family apart. The home office smelled of old paper and expensive leather. I reached blindly for the wall switch, but my hand was still trembling from the adrenaline. The room remained dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the large window. I walked toward my father's massive mahogany desk. It sat in the center of the room like a monument to his supposed authority. I opened the top right drawer, searching for a cloth or a napkin. He always kept a microfiber towel in there to clean his reading glasses. As I pulled the heavy wooden drawer open, the toe of my shoe caught the thick edge of the area rug. I lost my balance and stumbled forward. My hip slammed hard into the side of the desk. The sharp impact jolted the entire piece of furniture. A towering stack of thick manila folders rested dangerously close to the edge of the desk. I watched in slow motion as the stack tipped over. Dozens of files hit the floor with a loud slap. Papers slid across the dark hardwood, scattering in every direction. I looked down and immediately recognized the bold embossed logo on the covers. Harrison Development. These were Trevor's confidential business files. My father must have been reviewing them before dinner. They loved to play the roles of wealthy tycoons discussing high-level investments, even though everyone knew my father was just a retired manager, and Trevor's real estate projects always seemed to be mysteriously delayed. Old habits are incredibly hard to break. Even after everything that just happened in the dining room, my first instinct was to clean up the mess. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor. My cheeks still burned fiercely, but I started gathering the scattered papers. I stacked the financial projections, the zoning permits, and the colorful brochures Trevor used to court his investors. My hands were still shaking, and my palms were sticky with the Cabernet Sauvignon. I reached for a particularly thick document bound with a heavy legal clip. As my fingers closed around the top page, a single drop of dark red wine fell from my thumb. It landed right in the center of the crisp white paper. I let out a harsh breath. I did not want to give them another reason to scream at me. I frantically wiped my hand on my black dress, not caring about the fabric, and leaned close to the page to inspect the damage. The wine drop had soaked into the thick paper, creating a small red bloom right over the printed text. I squinted in the dim light of the study, trying to read what I had just stained. I am a senior corporate auditor. For the past 8 years, my entire professional life has been built on finding the tiny hidden details that other people desperately want to conceal. My brain is trained to scan massive blocks of text and instantly recognize financial anomalies. As I looked at the red stain, the words beneath it came into sharp focus. My eyes locked onto the bold black letters printed across the very top of the page. It read, Home Equity Line of Credit Application. My heart skipped a single painful beat. A home equity loan. I moved my eyes down to the borrower information section. I fully expected to see my father's name or Trevor's name. Instead, I saw something that pulled the air right out of my lungs. The primary borrower listed on the document was Clara Marie Sterling. My own name was printed in stark black ink. My social security number was typed out flawlessly right next to it. My date of birth, my permanent address. Every single piece of my personal identifying information was neatly organized on this financial application. I blinked hard, thinking the dim lighting was playing tricks on my mind. I pulled the document closer to my face. The words did not change. I scanned down to the property description section. The address listed was a small, modest cabin on a beautiful piece of land in upstate New York. It was the property my grandfather had left exclusively to me when he passed away 5 years ago. I loved that cabin. It was my grandfather's safe haven, and he wanted me to have it because he knew I never felt safe in this family. I had trusted my father to handle the tax paperwork for the property. He had offered to do it, claiming his accountant could easily fold it into his own tax filings to save me money. I had handed over the deed and the trust documents without a single second thought. How was my father? I never imagined he would do anything malicious. Now looking at this paper, the terrifying truth began to wash over me in freezing waves. I forced my shaking hands to turn the page. I read the specific loan details. The requested loan amount was $400,000. 400,000. They were borrowing against the entire appraised value of my grandfather's property. The property I owned outright. I looked at the disbursement instructions. The funds were not going to a bank account in my name. The money was scheduled to be wired directly into a corporate account registered to Harrison Development, Trevor's company. My family was using my inheritance, my spotless credit score, and my financial future to fund Trevor's fake empire. My breathing became shallow and incredibly fast. The physical sting of my mother's slap faded into absolute nothingness compared to the crushing weight of this discovery. This was not just toxic family behavior. This was not just a mother favoring one child over another. This was a massive calculated criminal conspiracy. They were actively stealing $400,000 from me. They were saddling me with a debt that would take decades to pay off. But for a loan this size, a home equity line of credit requires a verified signature. The primary borrower has to sign the legal documents in front of a notary. I quickly flipped past the loan terms, tearing through the thick packet until I reached the final signature page. I stared at the bottom line. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. Right there on the line, marked for the primary borrower, was my signature. It was not a messy scribble. It was not a clumsy attempt. It was a completely flawless forgery. The swoop of the C in Clara, the sharp angle of the S in Sterling. It looked exactly like the way I signed my name on every audit report I issued at work. Someone in this house had spent hours, maybe even days, practicing my signature until it was completely indistinguishable from the real thing. Right next to the forged signature was the official stamp of a notary public. A notary who clearly worked for Trevor or my father. They had planned this down to the very last detail. They knew exactly what they were doing. They sat around that dining room table tonight, drinking expensive wine, eating the turkey I cooked, laughing and toasting to Trevor's brilliant business success, all while knowing they had just ruined my financial life to pay for it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The drafty folding chair by the kitchen door, the constant daily insults, the slap across the face over a spilled drink. None of it was just casual cruelty. It was a symptom of how little they valued my humanity. To them, I was never a daughter or a sister. I was a human bank account. I was a disposable asset they could drain dry to keep their golden child living in absolute luxury. The tension in my chest rose to a rapid boiling point. My hands completely stopped shaking. The deep sadness and the desperate childhood desire to be loved by these people evaporated instantly. In their place, a cold, sharp clarity took over my mind. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient servant who would clean up the mess and apologize. They thought I was far too weak to ever fight back against them. They had completely forgotten what I do for a living. They had forgotten that I spend 60 hours a week hunting down financial fraud for the biggest corporations in the country. My family had just handed a loaded gun to a master sniper, and I was going to make sure they lost everything. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands had stopped shaking entirely. The panic that usually paralyzed me in this house was completely gone, replaced by a cold and sharp focus. I opened my camera app and began photographing every single page of the loan document. I captured the loan terms, the disbursement instructions, the notary stamp, and the flawless forgery of my signature. I made sure the lighting was clear and the text was perfectly legible. As a corporate auditor, I knew that documentation was the absolute key to survival. Without concrete proof, it was just my word against a family of practiced liars. Once I had every page saved to my device and securely backed up to my cloud storage, I carefully reassembled the stack of folders. I aligned the edges perfectly. I placed the wine-stained document near the middle exactly where I had found it. I closed the heavy wooden drawer with a soft click. I stepped out of my father's office and walked quietly down the hallway toward the front door. I did not go back to the dining room. I did not want to see their faces. I simply grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hall closet and slipped it on. "Clara!" My mother's voice cracked through the hallway like a whip. "Where do you think you are going? We have not even served dessert yet." I turned slowly. Patricia was standing in the dining room archway, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her face a mask of furious indignation. Behind her, I could see my father pouring another glass of expensive wine, and Trevor leaning back in his chair watching me with that same sickening smirk. They were waiting for me to apologize. They were waiting for me to beg for my seat back at the drafty folding chair by the kitchen door. "I am leaving," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. "Leaving?" Patricia scoffed, taking an aggressive step toward me. "You spill wine all over your sister's expensive dress. You cause a massive scene, and now you are just going to walk out on Christmas dinner. How absolutely disrespectful. You walk back into that kitchen and clean up your mess right now." I looked at the woman who had brought me into this world. I looked at the woman who had just slapped me across the face and then knowingly participated in stealing $400,000 from my future. I did not yell. I did not scream. I just opened the heavy oak front door and let the freezing December wind blow into the foyer. "Do not ignore me, Clara," Patricia shouted, her voice rising to a frantic pitch as I stepped out onto the porch. "If you walk away now, you are going to regret it. Do you hear me? You ruin everything you touch." I walked down the snowy driveway into the freezing night. The cold air felt incredible against my burning cheek. I did not look back. I unlocked my 6-year-old sedan, climbed inside, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the neighborhood, I could see my mother standing on the brightly lit porch, waving her arms in fury. Let her scream, I thought. Her screaming was not going to save her from what was coming. The drive back to my apartment took 30 minutes, but my mind was moving a million miles an hour. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an older brick building. It was quiet, clean, and completely mine. When I walked through the door, I did not bother turning on the main lights or taking off my winter coat. I went straight to my small kitchen table, opened my work laptop, and sat down. I pulled up the high-resolution photographs I had just taken in my father's office. I needed to understand exactly what I was looking at. A home equity line of credit for $400,000 is a massive financial commitment. It requires property appraisals, income verification, and a mountain of legal paperwork. My father could not have done this alone. I was not smart enough to orchestrate a fraud of this magnitude. This had Trevor written all over it. I opened a new tab on my secure browser and logged into the State Public Business Registry. I typed in Harrison Development, Trevor's supposed real estate empire. I have spent years tracking hidden assets and identifying corporate fraud for a living. Digging through public financial records was practically my second nature. Within 20 minutes, the grand illusion of Trevor Harrison began to crumble right in front of my eyes. Trevor was not a successful real estate developer. He was a rapidly sinking ship. The public filings showed multiple tax liens against his company. 2 of his major construction projects had been stalled for over a year due to unpaid contractor invoices. His corporate credit lines were completely maxed out. Harrison Development was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, and Trevor was desperately trying to keep the wealthy facade from completely collapsing. I pulled up the property tax records for my parents' house. It was exactly as I had suspected. My parents had already taken out 2 previous mortgages on their own home just to bail Trevor out of his past failures. They had drained their retirement accounts. They had 0 equity left in their own names. They were financially drowning right alongside him. But Trevor needed an immediate, massive injection of cash. I opened the social media pages for Harrison Development. For weeks, Trevor had been promoting his highly anticipated New Year's Eve investor gala at a luxury downtown hotel. It was supposed to be the prestigious event of the season, a lavish party designed to impress wealthy local politicians and secure millions in new funding. But luxury galas require massive upfront payments. The hotel ballroom, the premium catering, the expensive champagne, the private security, it all required hard cash that Trevor simply did not possess. That was when they set their sights on me. Actually, they set their sights on my grandfather's property. I cross-referenced the dates on the forged loan documents with the public records. The timeline was sickeningly clear. 3 weeks ago, Trevor's primary business account had faced an impending freeze due to massive outstanding debts. 3 weeks ago, my father had called me and casually offered to handle the annual tax filings for my grandfather's cabin, claiming his personal accountant could save me a few $100s. I had thanked him for his kindness and sent over the original deed and the trust documents. I had handed them the exact ammunition they needed to destroy me. They had used my property documents to apply for the $400,000 loan. They had hired a corrupt notary to officially stamp the fraudulent paperwork. They had spent hours practicing my signature until it was absolutely perfect. And they had directed the entire $400,000 to be wired directly into a shell account controlled by Harrison Development. The terrifying realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My parents had actively chosen to steal my identity and mortgage my entire future just to pay for Trevor's fake rich lifestyle. They had knowingly committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to save Chloe's husband from public humiliation. To them, Chloe's social status at a country club was worth absolutely more than my financial survival, my career, and my freedom. If Trevor defaulted on that massive loan, and looking at his disastrous financial records, he absolutely would default. The bank would foreclose on my grandfather's cabin. My pristine credit score would be utterly obliterated. I would instantly lose my professional auditing license. I would be buried in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, and my life would be completely ruined. They sat at that Christmas dinner table, eating the food I bought, drinking the wine I poured, and looking at me with pure disdain, all while knowing they had just sentenced me to financial death. My mother had slapped me across the face for spilling a few drops of wine on a silk dress that was probably purchased with the very money they had stolen from me. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing laptop screen. The apartment was completely silent. The clock on the wall ticked quietly past 2 in the morning. A strange, heavy peace settled over my entire body. I was not the clumsy, invisible daughter anymore. I was not the obedient family servant. I was a senior corporate auditor holding irrefutable proof of a massive financial felony committed by the very people who had abused me for 3 decades. They needed that $400,000 to keep the illusion alive. They needed it to fund the lavish New Year's Eve gala where Trevor planned to secure his next round of victims. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime because they believed I was too stupid and too submissive to ever find out. They were so incredibly wrong. I closed my laptop. The tears were completely gone. I walked over to my hall closet and pulled out a sturdy gift box. I gathered a roll of expensive wrapping paper, a silk ribbon, and a bright red marker. I was going to give my family a Christmas present they would remember for the rest of their miserable lives. And I was going to deliver it exactly at dawn. The sun rose over the snow-covered streets of my neighborhood, casting a harsh, bright light into my small apartment. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas morning. Normally, I would already be at my parents' house by now. I would be standing over the hot stove, wearing an apron, preparing a massive holiday breakfast, while the rest of the family slept in. I would be brewing the expensive imported coffee my mother demanded, and arranging fresh pastries on a silver platter for my sister Chloe and her husband Trevor. I would be the invisible servant, making sure their holiday was absolutely perfect. But today, the only thing I was preparing was their absolute downfall. I sat at my small kitchen table, sipping a cup of black coffee. In front of me was the thick stack of printed documents I had stayed up all night compiling. I had pulled the public property records for my grandfather's cabin. I had pulled Trevor's disastrous corporate tax filings from the state business registry. And most importantly, I had the crisp, high-resolution photocopy of the $400,000 home equity line of credit application. The specific document with my flawlessly forged signature printed right at the bottom. I picked up a thick red marker from my desk. I uncapped it and drew a heavy, inescapable red circle around that fake signature. I traced the circle 3 times until the red ink bled through the back of the white page. I wanted to make sure that when my father opened this package, his eyes would be violently pulled to the exact crime that was going to send them all to federal prison. As a senior corporate auditor, I knew exactly how financial institutions handled wire fraud and identity theft. The bank would not just cancel the loan, they would involve federal investigators. My parents and Trevor had completely crossed a legal boundary that had no return path. Next to the stack of legal papers sat a tangled pile of cream-colored silk. It was Chloe's ruined designer dress, the one I had accidentally spilled red wine on the night before. What my mother and my sister completely forgot in their theatrical outrage was that I was the actual person who bought that dress for Chloe in the first place. I had purchased it for her birthday 3 months ago, spending almost $800 because she had whined about needing a new outfit for Trevor's upcoming New Year's Eve investor gala. I still had the original store receipt sitting right in my wallet. When my mother had screamed at me to clean up the spilled wine, Chloe had marched upstairs, changed into sweatpants, and thrown the stained silk dress directly at my chest, demanding I take it to a specialty dry cleaner the very next morning. I had carried that dress into my father's study to grab a towel. I had it draped over my arm when I stumbled and knocked over Trevor's confidential folders. Now that ruined dress was going to be the centerpiece of my Christmas gift to them. I carefully folded the photocopy of the forged loan document and tucked it right into the center of the dark red wine stain on the silk fabric. I wrapped the silk around the paper, creating a tight, secure bundle. Then I reached for a heavy, elegant gift box and the thick, glossy wrapping paper I had bought for the holidays. I took my time wrapping the box. I wanted it to look absolutely perfect. I folded the edges with the crisp precision I applied to my audit reports. I tied a wide velvet green ribbon around the box and shaped it into a flawless, symmetrical bow. It looked exactly like the kind of expensive high-end gift my mother obsessed over. The kind of gift she demanded from me every single year while giving me cheap clearance rack items in return. She cared entirely about appearances. I was going to use that exact weakness against her. Finally, I pulled out a heavy piece of blank cardstock. I needed a message that would instantly shatter their smug confidence. I needed them to know that the quiet, obedient daughter they had used as a financial punching bag was officially dead. I took my black pen and wrote 2 sentences in clear, steady handwriting. I am not blind, but by New Year's Eve, you will be bankrupt. I slid the card securely under the green velvet ribbon. I put on my heavy winter coat, picked up the box, and walked out to my car. The drive to my parents' house took exactly 25 minutes. The city streets were completely empty and covered in a fresh layer of white snow. The entire world seemed to be tucked warmly inside their homes, opening presents, drinking hot cocoa, and celebrating with people who actually loved them. For 31 years, I had desperately craved that kind of morning. I had bought my family lavish gifts, cooked their extravagant meals, and sacrificed my own happiness, just hoping they would pull me out of the cold and let me sit by the fire with them. I realized now that they never wanted me by the fire. They just wanted me to chop the wood and burn my own hands to keep them warm. I turned onto their street. The massive colonial houses were decorated with elegant, understated white lights. My parents' house stood at the very end of the cul-de-sac, projecting a fake image of massive wealth and stability. Trevor's leased luxury SUV was parked directly in the driveway. My father's pristine sedan was parked right next to it. They were all still inside, probably sleeping off the expensive wine I had purchased for them last night. They were sleeping deeply, believing they had successfully secured $400,000 of stolen money to fund Trevor's failing business empire. I parked my car a few houses down and walked the rest of the way. The freezing morning air bit at my cheeks, but I barely felt it. My heart was completely calm. There was no anxiety. There was no fear. I was moving with the cold, calculated efficiency of someone who had nothing left to lose. I had spent my entire life being afraid of my mother's anger and my father's silent disappointment. That fear evaporated the second I saw my forged signature on those loan documents. I walked up the long, snow-covered driveway. My boots crunched softly against the pavement, breaking the absolute silence of the neighborhood. I climbed the 3 brick steps to the front porch. The heavy oak front door was securely locked. I could picture the scene inside perfectly. The ruined dining room rug. The empty wine glasses left on the table for me to clean. The complete lack of concern for the daughter they had just assaulted and driven out into the freezing night. I placed the beautifully wrapped box directly in the center of the welcome mat. I positioned it perfectly so that whoever opened the door would have to look straight down and see the green velvet ribbon and the crisp white card tucked beneath it. I stood there for a long moment staring at the closed door. I imagined my mother, Patricia, waking up and coming downstairs in her silk robe to make coffee. I imagined her opening the front door to retrieve the morning newspaper. I imagined her spotting the elegant gift box and immediately assuming it was a desperate apology gift from me. She would think I had caved. She would think I had spent hundreds of dollars to make amends for ruining her perfect Christmas dinner. She would smile her cruel, triumphant smile, bring the box inside to the kitchen island, and call Chloe and Trevor down to watch her open my supposed surrender. I could picture the exact moment her arrogant smile would disappear. She would untie that perfect ribbon. She would tear away the expensive wrapping paper. She would see the ruined silk dress she thought I was taking to the dry cleaner. She would pull out the folded piece of paper hidden inside the fabric. She would see the thick red circle around the forged signature on a $400,000 fraudulent loan document. And finally, she would read my note. The panic that would consume that kitchen would be absolute. Trevor would realize his massive federal crime had been discovered by a certified corporate auditor. My father would realize his passive complicity had just cost him his freedom. My mother would realize her favorite golden child was married to a broke criminal and that the daughter she slapped last night held the keys to all their prison cells. I took one last look at the house that had been my emotional prison for 3 decades. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. They had decided that my financial destruction was an acceptable price to pay for their country club social status. They were about to learn that the quiet auditor they had abused for years was far more dangerous than they could ever comprehend. I turned my back on the front door. I walked down the brick steps and back to my car. I got inside, started the engine, and turned the heater on high. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the neighborhood behind me. As I drove back toward the city, a profound sense of liberation washed over my entire body. The ticking clock had officially started. They were going to wake up in a few hours. They were going to open that box, and the absolute terror that was going to consume that house would be just the very beginning of their punishment. The war had officially started, and I already knew exactly how I was going to finish it. I sat at my small kitchen table, watching the digital clock on my microwave slowly flip to exactly 9:30 in the morning. I had barely taken a sip of my second cup of black coffee when the screen of my cell phone lit up the dark room. The caller identification flashed my mother's name, Patricia Sterling. The house must have finally woken up. They must have opened the heavy oak front door to get the morning newspaper. They had found my Christmas gift sitting on the welcome mat. The phone vibrated violently against the wooden table, creating a harsh buzzing sound. I did not answer the first call. I just sat back and watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang a second time, then a third. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm reflecting the exact panic I knew was currently tearing through their kitchen. On the fourth ring, I slowly reached out and pressed the green accept button. I brought the phone to my ear and said absolutely nothing. I just listened to the heavy breathing on the other end. "Clara, what is the meaning of this?" Patricia screamed. Her voice was so shrill and panicked that it physically hurt my eardrum. "How dare you leave a piece of trash on our front porch on Christmas morning? What is wrong with your mind?" I took a slow, calming breath. "It is a copy of a fraudulent loan document, Mother. It has my forged signature on it." "You had no right," Patricia shrieked, completely bypassing any denial of the actual crime. Her panic was rapidly stripping away every single layer of her refined country club persona. "How could you snoop through your father's private desk? You invaded our privacy. You violated the sanctity of this house." I let out a harsh, dry laugh. "I invaded your privacy. You stole $400,000 from me. You mortgaged my grandfather's cabin behind my back to pay for a party." "We did not steal anything," Patricia snapped, her voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of rage and sheer terror. "Trevor just needed a temporary bridge loan for his new development project downtown. He's going to pay it all back with interest right after the New Year's Eve investor gala. Your father was just trying to help family. We were going to tell you about it when the time was right. You are ruining everything. You forged my signature on federal banking documents," I said, my voice remaining entirely cold and flat. Suddenly, Patricia shifted her tactics. The angry screaming stopped, and the fake wavering tears began. "Clara, please. You are blowing this entirely out of proportion. We are your family. I am your mother. We gave you life. Trevor is your brother-in-law, and he's under a tremendous amount of stress right now. If you cancel this loan, you will ruin his entire business. You will completely ruin Chloe's marriage. How can you be so incredibly selfish? Why are you trying to destroy your own sister's happiness over a temporary financial arrangement?" I closed my eyes. The sheer emotional manipulation was absolutely staggering. She was actually trying to make me feel guilty for objecting to my own identity theft. "You slapped me across the face last night over a spilled glass of wine," I said quietly. "You treated me like a stray dog for 31 years. You made me sit by the kitchen door while you toasted the man who was actively robbing me. And now you expect me to happily fund your fake wealthy lifestyle. You are not my family. You are a thief. Clara, listen to me right now." Patricia's voice turned incredibly dark and threatening. "If you go to the police, you will send your own father to federal prison. Do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to kill your father?" "No," I replied smoothly. "You and Trevor already did that." I ended the call before she could scream another word. My phone immediately rang again less than 5 seconds later. This time the screen showed Trevor Harrison. I pressed the accept button and put the phone to my ear. "Listen to me, you little corporate rat," Trevor snarled. The charming, sophisticated real estate developer act was completely gone. He sounded like a desperate, cornered animal. I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing today, but you are going to stop right now. There is no game, Trevor, I said. I am shutting down the home equity line of credit. I am reporting the fraud to the bank. You will not do a single thing. Trevor spat back, his breathing heavy and erratic. Do you think you are the only one who understands how the corporate world works? I have friends on the state auditing board, Clara. Powerful friends. Men who golf with the senior partners at your firm. If you even try to blow the whistle on this loan, I will personally guarantee that you never work in finance again. I remained absolutely silent, letting him dig his grave deeper with every word. He took my silence for fear and continued his unhinged rant. Here is what is going to happen, Trevor said, his voice dripping with venom and arrogance. If you go to the bank or the police, I will tell them that you were fully aware of this transaction from the very beginning. I will say that you willingly co-signed the loan to invest in my company, but then you got extremely greedy. I will tell them that you demanded a massive cut of my profits, and when I refused, you threw a tantrum and claimed forgery. It will be your word against mine, Chloe's and your parents, 4 voices against 1. Who do you think the federal investigators are going to believe? You will look like a hysterical, greedy sister trying to extort her own wealthy family. The sheer audacity of his plan was breathtaking. He was banking entirely on the fact that I was the designated family scapegoat. He genuinely believed that because my parents always took Chloe's side in childhood arguments, they could easily outvote me in a federal fraud investigation. He thought the legal system functioned exactly like my mother's dining room table. You are highly delusional, Trevor, I said calmly. I am a man who protects what belongs to him, Trevor fired back. You have exactly 24 hours, Clara. I'm having my attorney draft a retroactive authorization form as we speak. It states that you gave verbal and written consent for your father to sign on your behalf as your legal financial proxy. You're going to sign that document and get it notarized by tomorrow morning. And if I refuse, I asked, keeping my tone completely level. If you refuse, I will call my contacts at the auditing board before noon, Trevor threatened. I will have your professional license suspended pending an internal fraud investigation. I will drag your name through the mud until your corporate firm fires you. You will be bankrupt, unemployed, and facing severe extortion charges. Do not test me, Clara. You are a nobody. You are just the pathetic, lonely sister who serves the turkey at Christmas. I am a highly connected businessman. I will absolutely crush you. I was breathing heavily into the receiver. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg for mercy and submit to his authority. For 31 years, my family had conditioned me to back down whenever someone raised their voice or threatened my stability. But as I sat in my quiet kitchen listening to this arrogant fraudster threaten my entire livelihood, I felt absolutely no fear. I was a senior corporate auditor. I spent my days tearing apart the complicated financial ledgers of multi-million-dollar corporations. I dealt with ruthless executives and complex tax evasion schemes for a living. Trevor Harrison was just a petty, desperate con artist wearing an expensive gold watch. Are you completely finished? I asked. My voice was so incredibly cold and steady that it actually caught him off guard. What did you just say to me? Trevor demanded, his voice dropping. I asked if you were finished, I repeated, because you just threatened a licensed auditor with blackmail and extortion over an unsecure phone line. You are not a connected businessman, Trevor. You are drowning in massive debt, your construction projects are failing, and you had to steal from a 31-year-old woman just to pay for a hotel ballroom on New Year's Eve. Shut your mouth, he yelled. No, I replied. I will not sign your retroactive authorization form. I will not cover up your massive federal crime. You have 24 hours to enjoy your fake wealthy life, Trevor, because after that, the only thing you will be developing is a defense strategy for a federal judge. I hung up the phone before he could scream another word. I immediately went into my cell phone settings and blocked my mother's number, my father's number, Chloe's number, and Trevor's number. The sudden absolute silence in my apartment was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. I knew exactly what blocking them would do. It would drive them into an absolute state of paranoid panic. Trevor and Patricia thrived on total control and constant emotional manipulation. By cutting off their direct access to me, I was completely stripping away their only weapon. They would be trapped in that big, quiet house, staring at each other, wondering what my next move would be. They would jump at every passing car and panic at every knock on their front door. Making them wait in the terrifying dark was vastly superior to screaming at them. I walked over to my desk and plugged my phone into my computer. I opened my audio recording application. When Trevor had started speaking, I had quietly pressed the record button. I now possessed a crystal clear high-definition audio file of Trevor Harrison explicitly admitting to the fraudulent loan and actively attempting to blackmail a licensed financial professional. I uploaded the audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I then placed the original digital file onto a designated encrypted flash drive. They thought I was just the clumsy, invisible daughter who ruined silk dresses. They thought my silence at the dinner table meant I was weak and easily broken. But I was not weak. I was simply calculating my next move. I had all the evidence, I had the timeline, and I had the absolute determination to see this through to the very bitter end. The fallout had officially begun, and there was absolutely no stopping the financial avalanche that was about to crash directly down onto their heads. After I ended the call with Trevor, the heavy silence of my apartment pressed down on me from all sides. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the blank screen of my cell phone. For just a fraction of a second, an old familiar weight settled deep in my chest. It was the exact same feeling of sheer panic I had when I was 7 years old, standing in the dark hallway, listening to my mother tell my father that I was too difficult, too awkward, and too much of a burden compared to Chloe. That deep-seated childhood fear began to rise in my throat, choking me. My hands started to tremble again against the wooden table. A lifetime of cruel conditioning kicked in, telling me to simply surrender. My brain whispered that maybe Trevor was right. Maybe he really did have powerful friends at the state auditing board. Maybe my parents would hire expensive corporate lawyers and completely destroy my professional career. Maybe it would be infinitely easier to just sign the retroactive authorization form, give them my grandfather's property, and fade back into the background like a good, obedient daughter. The little girl inside my memory was absolutely terrified. She was begging me to apologize, to smooth things over, to make the screaming stop. She wanted to give them everything they wanted, just to earn a tiny scrap of their fake love. I stood up from the kitchen table, pushing the wooden chair back. My legs felt heavy, like I was moving through deep freezing water. I walked down the short hallway of my apartment and stepped into my small, brightly lit bathroom. I turned on the vanity light and looked directly at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look away. The woman staring back at me looked completely exhausted, but that was not what caught my attention. On my left cheek, blossoming under my pale skin, was a dark, angry purple bruise. It was the exact shape of my mother's hand. It was the absolute physical evidence of her uncontrollable rage. I reached up and gently touched the swollen skin. The sharp flare of pain sent a massive electric shockwave straight through my nervous system. It instantly burned away the heavy fog of childhood trauma. I was not 7 years old anymore. I was a 31-year-old senior corporate auditor. I had earned my degree with high honors. I had built a successful career completely on my own, without a single dollar from my parents. I owned my own life. That purple bruise was not a symbol of my failure. It was absolute proof of their utter desperation. They only hit you when they have completely run out of intelligent arguments. I lowered my hand from my cheek. The terrified little girl inside my head finally went completely silent, replaced by a cold, calculating professional. I walked back to my kitchen table and picked up my phone. I had already recorded Trevor's unhinged telephone call using a secondary application I kept for corporate meetings. I connected my phone to my laptop and pulled up the audio file. I put my headphones on and pressed play. I listened to Trevor Harrison, a man who desperately wanted society to think he was a sophisticated real estate developer, scream that he was going to destroy me. I listened to him explicitly demand that I sign fraudulent paperwork under the direct threat of blackmail and professional extortion. He had handed me the absolute perfect weapon on a silver platter. I saved the audio file to my desktop. I then opened my secure web browser and uploaded the recording to 3 completely separate, encrypted cloud storage servers. I saved another copy to a physical flash drive and locked it securely in my small fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. If Trevor somehow managed to steal my phone or hire someone to hack my computer, it would not matter at all. The evidence was immortal. It was safe, secure, and ready to be deployed the absolute second I needed it. With the evidence secured, I picked up my phone one last time. I opened my contacts list. I scrolled down to my mother's name, Patricia Sterling, the woman who gave birth to me and then spent 3 decades trying to make me feel completely worthless. I pressed the block button. Next was my father, Richard Sterling, the passive coward who sat eating his roasted turkey while his wife committed physical assault against his youngest child. Blocked. Then came my sister, Chloe Harrison, The golden child who would happily let me drown in a freezing river if it meant she could keep her precious country club membership. Blocked. Finally, I went to Trevor's contact information. I hovered my finger over the screen for a long moment, savoring the profound sense of absolute control I possessed right now. I pressed block. I set the phone down on the table. The sudden, absolute silence in my apartment was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. I knew exactly what blocking them would accomplish. It would drive them into an absolute state of paranoid panic. Trevor and Patricia thrived on total control and constant emotional manipulation. Their entire toxic dynamic relied on me reacting to their outrageous demands. They needed me to cry, to argue, or to beg for forgiveness so they could feel powerful. By cutting off their direct access to me, I was completely stripping away their only weapon. They would be trapped in that big quiet house, staring at each other, wondering what my next move would be. They would jump at every passing car in their neighborhood. They would panic at every single knock on their grand front door. They would obsess over whether I was sitting at the local police station or sitting in a federal investigator's office. I walked over to my living room window and looked out at the snow falling gently over the city streets. I pictured my mother pacing the hardwood floors of her pristine living room, clutching her expensive phone, dialing my number over and over again, only to be met with a cold automated voicemail greeting. I pictured Trevor pouring himself a massive glass of dark scotch, his hands trembling violently as he suddenly realized that his empty threats had completely failed to break me. I pictured Chloe crying real, genuine tears this time, finally understanding that her lavish New Year's Eve gala was currently dangling over a massive legal cliff. Making them wait in the terrifying dark was vastly superior to screaming at them over the telephone. Silence is the absolute worst punishment you can inflict on a group of raging narcissists. Without a target to actively attack, they would slowly begin to turn on each other. The stress of the unknown would rot them from the inside out. I spent the rest of Christmas Day in absolute glorious peace. I made myself a fresh pot of hot coffee. I cooked a simple warm meal for myself. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was leaving behind. For the first time in my 31 years on this earth, I was not worried about ruining their perfect holiday. They had ruined their own lives the exact moment they forged my signature on that home equity line of credit application. The war had officially started, and I already knew exactly how I was going to finish it. I spent the entire evening organizing my personal financial documents, preparing a meticulous timeline of events, and drafting a highly detailed summary of Trevor's failing public business records. I printed out the property tax history for my parents' house, proving they had absolutely zero equity left to their names. I printed out the public records of Trevor's stalled construction projects and his unpaid contractor invoices. I compiled every single piece of data into a thick, organized binder. I was treating my own life like a high-stakes corporate audit. My family had thought they could treat me like a disposable financial asset. They thought I was stupid enough to just take the fall for their massive greed and their desperate need to maintain a fake, wealthy image. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the daughter they had abused for 31 years. When a senior corporate auditor finds a massive legal discrepancy, they do not ever stop digging until the entire corrupt enterprise is burned directly to the ground. I closed the heavy binder and ran my hand over the smooth cover. Tomorrow morning, I was going to find the most ruthless financial fraud attorney in the entire city, and I was going to hand them the matches. It was the morning of December 27th, when the absolute silence I had imposed on my family was violently shattered. I was sitting alone in my apartment, drinking my coffee and organizing the massive stack of financial documents when my cell phone buzzed. I had blocked my parents and my sister and my brother-in-law, but I had not blocked the rest of my extended family. That was a tactical error on my part, but it was one that provided me with a masterclass in how toxic families operate when they are pushed into a corner. The phone vibrated against the table. Then it vibrated 3 more times in rapid succession. I picked it up and saw a text message from my Aunt Susan, who was my mother's older sister. The message did not ask how my Christmas was. It did not ask how I was doing. I opened the message and felt a cold wave wash over my entire body. Aunt Susan wrote, "Clara, your mother just called me in absolute tears. I am so incredibly worried about you. Patricia said you had some sort of severe mental breakdown at Christmas dinner. She said you physically attacked Chloe over a spilled drink and then started screaming paranoid delusions about Trevor stealing your identity. Please, sweetheart, you need to seek psychiatric help immediately. Your family loves you and they just want to get you into a facility before you completely destroy your career. Please call your mother and apologize. I stared at the glowing screen. A mental breakdown, paranoid delusions, a facility. I actually let out a harsh, dry laugh that echoed in my quiet kitchen. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. Patricia was an absolute master of social warfare. She knew that my sudden silence meant she had lost direct control over me. She knew that the forged home equity line of credit for $400,000 was a ticking time bomb, and that I held all the detonators. So instead of trying to fix the actual crime, she decided to completely destroy the credibility of the witness. If she could convince the entire extended family and her powerful social circle that I was clinically insane, then any accusation I made about bank fraud would just look like the wild rantings of a mentally ill daughter. She was painting herself as the tragic, heartbroken mother of a disturbed child. The messages kept pouring into my phone, proving just how fast Patricia had worked the phones. It was a perfectly coordinated smear campaign designed to isolate me completely. My cousin Mark texted next. He wrote, "Clara, I heard you are off your medication and saying crazy things about Trevor's business. You know Trevor is a successful developer. You sound insane right now. Stop terrorizing your parents and get some professional help." I read the words and shook my head. I had never taken medication in my life. I had never had a single psychological issue. I was a senior corporate auditor who worked 60-hour weeks. Yet Mark, a man who only saw me at Thanksgiving dinners, immediately swallowed the lie because my mother served it to him on a silver platter. Then came the message from Mrs. Gable, the head of the local church committee my mother proudly chaired. "Clara, your mother asked our morning prayer group to pray for your mental health today. She told us how you stormed out into the snow, making wild false accusations about your family's finances. We are all praying that you find the humility to apologize to your mother and your sister for ruining their holiday. It takes a big person to admit they need professional help. We are here for you when you decide to repent." I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. My mother had literally weaponized her church prayer group to paint me as a hysterical, aggressive lunatic. She was using her status in the community to build a fortress of lies around her. She was laying the groundwork to ensure that when the bank inevitably collapsed on Trevor, no one would believe a single word I said. They would just click their tongues and say, "It was such a shame that Patricia's daughter had lost her mind and tried to ruin her sister's husband." For a brief, terrible moment, the sheer weight of the isolation threatened to crush me. I imagined all these aunts, uncles, cousins, and church friends sitting in their comfortable, warm homes, shaking their heads and pitying poor Patricia for having such a disturbed daughter. These were people I had known my entire life. These were people I had baked cookies for, people I had helped move, people who had watched me grow up into a responsible, quiet adult. Yet they believed Patricia's absolute fiction without a single shred of hesitation. Not a single one of them called me to ask for my side of the story. Not one of them paused to question why a rational 31-year-old finance professional with a spotless record would suddenly invent a complex story about real estate fraud and forged signatures. They just blindly accepted that I was broken because it was far easier than believing Patricia Sterling, the perfect suburban housewife, was actually a ruthless identity thief. A year ago, receiving these messages would have completely broken me. A year ago, the thought of my entire extended family hating me and thinking I was crazy would have sent me running back to my mother's house in tears. I would have begged for forgiveness just to make the horrible rumors stop. I would have signed any document Trevor put in front of me just to restore my good name in the family. That was exactly what Patricia was counting on. She was using the threat of complete social exile to force me back into my designated role as the obedient, silent servant. But as I sat there, looking at my phone, vibrating with more hateful messages, something inside my chest hardened into solid ice. I realized right then that I had been desperately holding onto a family tree that was completely rotten to its very core. Their love was entirely conditional. It relied strictly on me being the quiet, agreeable punching bag. The absolute second I stepped out of that box, the second I demanded respect and refused to be financially exploited, they were perfectly willing to brand me as insane. Instead of breaking my spirit, their eager betrayal gave me something incredibly powerful. It gave me absolute freedom. I absorbed their terrible messages. I read every single one of them, letting the unfairness and the cruelty wash over me. And then I used it as pure, high-octane fuel. The little girl who wanted her aunts and cousins to like her was gone. The corporate auditor, who understood exactly how to dismantle a fraudulent enterprise, was fully in charge now. These messages were not just insults, they were evidence. They were proof of a desperate cover-up. Patricia was overplaying her hand because she was terrified. People who are innocent do not spend their mornings calling 50 different relatives to preemptively declare their accuser insane. People who are innocent do not weaponize church prayer groups. They do that when they know they are guilty, and they are desperately trying to control the narrative before the police arrive. I picked up my phone and went through the messages one by one. I did not reply to defend myself. I did not try to convince my Aunt Susan or my cousin Mark or Mrs. Gable of the truth. Trying to argue with flying monkeys who have already chosen their master is a complete waste of time. I simply took a screenshot of every single message, ensuring I had a documented record of Patricia's smear campaign. Then I blocked Aunt Susan, I blocked cousin Mark, I blocked Mrs. Gable. I blocked every single extended family member who had reached out to scold me. I sat back and took a deep breath. The people who truly mattered in my life were the ones who respected my boundaries. My colleagues, my friends, my mentors. The rest of these people were just background noise supporting a criminal conspiracy because it was socially convenient for them. My mother thought her smear campaign was going to shame me into submission. She thought the fear of being an outcast would bring me to my knees. She did not realize that by severing all my social ties to the family, she was actually cutting the very last strings that held me back. She was giving me full permission to absolutely destroy her without a single ounce of guilt. I was completely isolated, and that made me the most dangerous person in the world to them. I gathered my folders, placed them neatly into my leather briefcase, and grabbed my car keys. It was time to go find a lawyer who specialized in putting wealthy frauds into federal prison. The morning after, Patricia unleashed her vicious smear campaign across my entire extended family. I walked into the downtown office of Caldwell and Partners. The reception area was incredibly quiet, lined with dark wood paneling and thick carpets that absorbed every sound. For a brief second, as I stood before the heavy glass doors, a tiny wave of that old familiar childhood anxiety washed over me. My mother had just spent 24 hours telling everyone who would listen that I was completely insane. A small part of my brain, the part that had been conditioned to accept the role of the family scapegoat, wondered if I should just turn around and go back to my apartment. But then I touched my left cheek. The bruise from my mother's hand was still tender. I straightened my posture, tightened my grip on my heavy leather briefcase, and walked up to the receptionist. I was not a frightened child. I was a senior corporate auditor. I was here to do my job. David Caldwell was a man who commanded absolute respect the very second you walked into his office. He was in his early 60s, with sharp silver hair, a perfectly tailored gray suit, and piercing eyes that looked like they had seen every possible variation of human greed. He was a veteran white-collar criminal defense and fraud attorney. When I sat down across from his massive desk, he folded his hands and looked at me with a polite but cautious expression. He had seen countless family disputes over inheritances and petty jealousies. I knew exactly what he was expecting. He was expecting a weeping daughter complaining about unfair parents. I did not shed a single tear. I did not complain about my childhood. I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out the crisp photocopy of the home equity line of credit application. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany desk. I told him that my parents and my brother-in-law had forged my signature to take out a $400,000 loan against a property I owned outright. David picked up the document. His eyes scanned the page quickly. He noted the forgery, but he still maintained a neutral professional expression. He explained gently that forgery is notoriously difficult to prove when family members cover for each other. He said my parents could claim I gave them verbal authorization. It becomes a messy battle in civil court. I simply nodded. Then I reached into my briefcase again. I placed my laptop on his desk and opened the audio file I had saved from Christmas morning. I told David to listen very carefully. I pressed play. Trevor's unhinged, arrogant voice filled the quiet law office. We listened as Trevor explicitly threatened to destroy my career. We listened to him admit that he was having his attorney draft a retroactive authorization form to cover up the transaction. We listened as he confidently declared that my parents and my sister would all lie under oath to protect him. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the room was incredibly heavy. David Caldwell slowly took off his reading glasses. The polite, cautious expression was completely gone from his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He said, his voice dropping to a serious tone, that what we just heard was textbook extortion and blackmail. But I was not finished. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out the heavy 3-inch binder I had compiled during my midnight audit. I placed it squarely in the center of his desk. I explained that I was a senior corporate auditor and that I had spent the entire night tearing apart the public financial records of Harrison Development. I told David that Trevor's real estate company was an absolute illusion. I pointed to the meticulously organized tabs in the binder. Tab A contained the tax liens. Tab B held the records of stalled construction projects. Tab C documented the unpaid contractor invoices. I laid out the exact timeline showing how Trevor desperately needed $400,000 in hard cash to fund his upcoming New Year's Eve investor gala so he could lure in new victims. David opened the binder. He spent the next 20 minutes reading through my analysis. He flipped from page to page, tracing his finger over the highlighted spreadsheets and the cross-referenced property records. The only sound in the room was the turning of paper and the soft hum of the city traffic far below the window. I sat perfectly still, waiting for his verdict. Finally, David closed the heavy binder and looked at me. His eyes were wide with genuine, absolute respect. He said quietly that he had hired forensic accountants who charged $1,000 an hour, and they had never handed him a dossier this bulletproof. He told me that I had completely mapped out an entire criminal enterprise. Hearing those words from a seasoned legal veteran sent a massive wave of validation straight through my chest. For 31 years, my family had treated me like I was stupid. They called me clumsy. They called me blind. They made me sit by the kitchen door because they thought I had absolutely nothing of value to offer the world. But sitting in this high-rise law office, I was finally being recognized for exactly who I was. I was brilliant. I was thorough. And I was about to become their absolute worst nightmare. David stood up and walked over to the large window looking out at the gray sky. He said, I had a very strong case for civil litigation. We could sue them for forgery and halt the loan. But if we did that, they would hire aggressive lawyers. They would drag this out in family court for years. They would try to exhaust my financial resources. My mother would continue her social smear campaign to isolate me completely. In the meantime, the bank might still try to foreclose on my grandfather's cabin because the loan is technically active. David turned to look at me and firmly stated that we could not let them dictate the pace of this battle. We needed to completely obliterate their ability to fight back. I turned in my chair to face him and asked how we were going to do that. We take it out of state civil court and we hand it directly to the federal government, David replied, walking back to his desk. We do not just want a lawsuit, Clara. We want a federal wire fraud investigation, but to ensure the authorities take this case immediately and freeze his assets before New Year's Eve, we need to give them an active, ongoing federal crime. Right now, Trevor has the stolen $400,000 sitting in a local commercial bank account. He's local. The property is local. The bank is local. It is fraud, but we need to elevate it. We need Trevor to panic and move that money across state lines. The absolute second he wires stolen funds to an out-of-state or offshore account to hide it from a potential lawsuit, it triggers immediate federal jurisdiction. I completely understood the strategy. My mind instantly shifted into the precise logical framework of an audit trap. I said, putting the pieces together, that we needed to make him think I was coming after the money. But we also needed to make him think I was too weak to actually stop him. We had to trigger his arrogance and his fear at the exact same time. David smiled, and it was a sharp, predatory smile. He said, Trevor believes you are the weak family scapegoat. He believes his threats on the phone actually worked. So we are going to play directly into his massive ego. Later today, David explained he was going to send a very soft, very weak legal letter to Trevor's corporate office. The letter would simply state that I was deeply concerned about the loan and that I was formally requesting a family mediation session on January 2nd to discuss the financial misunderstanding. I nodded slowly, picturing Trevor reading that letter. He would laugh. He would show it to my mother and my father. They would all celebrate, thinking I was too scared to go to the police and was instead begging for a pathetic family meeting. They would think they had won. When Trevor reads that letter, he will feel absolutely untouchable, David explained, leaning over the desk. But Trevor is also a desperate fraudster hiding massive debts. He knows a mediation means lawyers will eventually look at his books. His immediate instinct will be to protect his cash before the January 2nd meeting. He will not leave $400,000 sitting in a local account where a judge could potentially freeze it during a dispute. He will try to hide it. He will wire it to an offshore holding account or an out-of-state shell company to secure his gala funds. And the exact moment he hits the transfer button on his computer, I added, completing the thought, the federal wire fraud is committed. David sat back down and folded his hands over my heavy binder. And because we will have already provided this beautiful audit and the forgery evidence to the bank's internal fraud division, the bank will instantly flag the transfer. The federal authorities will step in. Trevor's accounts will be frozen solid. He will not have a single dollar to pay for his New Year's Eve gala, and the investigators will have all the evidence they need to secure an arrest warrant. I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. The plan was absolutely brilliant. It did not require me to scream at my mother. It did not require me to argue with my sister or beg my father to finally stand up for me. It simply required me to step out of their way and let their own massive greed pull them straight off a cliff. For my entire life, I had tried to prevent my family from falling apart. Now I was going to hand them the shovel and watch them dig their own graves. "Send the letter, David," I said, my voice completely steady and resolved. "Let us give Trevor Harrison exactly enough rope to hang himself." The sound of David Caldwell typing on his heavy mechanical keyboard felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. I sat in his luxurious downtown office, watching him construct the perfect piece of legal bait. For 31 years, my family had relied on my absolute compliance. They had conditioned me to be the peacekeeper, the quiet girl who absorbed their insults and cleaned up their messes just to avoid conflict. David and I knew that if we wanted to trap Trevor Harrison, we had to give him exactly what he expected to see. We had to show him a broken, terrified Clara. David printed the letter and slid it across the polished mahogany desk for my review. It was a masterpiece of manufactured weakness. The document was drafted on standard legal letterhead, but the language was intentionally soft and hesitant. It did not mention the police. It did not mention federal investigators or wire fraud. Instead, it politely referred to the $400,000 fraudulent loan as a concerning financial misunderstanding. It stated that I was deeply distressed by the recent events, but that I valued my family and wanted to avoid any public litigation. The final paragraph was the actual hook. It formally requested a private family mediation session to be held on January 2nd at a neutral location to quietly resolve the matter. I read the letter twice. It made me sound exactly like the pathetic, cowardly sister Trevor believed me to be. It made it look like his vicious threats over the phone had completely worked. He had threatened to destroy my career as a senior corporate auditor, and this letter was my supposed white flag of surrender. I picked up a pen and signed the bottom of the page, my real signature, not the flawless forgery they had used to steal my grandfather's property. We sent the letter by priority courier directly to the corporate office of Harrison Development. I knew exactly what would happen the second Trevor opened that heavy envelope. He would lean back in his expensive leather executive chair, and a massive, arrogant smirk would spread across his face. He would immediately call my mother Patricia and my sister Chloe to gloat. I would tell them that his aggressive tactics had completely broken me. They would all breathe a massive sigh of relief. Patricia would probably pour a glass of expensive champagne in her pristine kitchen, celebrating the fact that her messy, embarrassing problem had been swept neatly under the rug. They would look at the January 2nd mediation date and assume they had plenty of time to bully me into officially signing over the loan money. They would feel utterly untouchable. But David and I understood the fatal flaw of a desperate narcissist. Trevor was a man drowning in massive debt. His real estate business was an illusion built on unpaid contractors and maxed out credit lines. He desperately needed that stolen $400,000 to fund his lavish New Year's Eve investor gala. The gala was his absolute last chance to secure new money from wealthy local politicians and keep his fake empire afloat. When Trevor looked at that letter, he would see my surrender, but his paranoid criminal mind would also see a massive risk. A mediation session on January 2nd meant that lawyers would eventually be involved. It meant that someone might eventually ask to look at his corporate books. A desperate man with stolen money in a local commercial bank account does not leave that money sitting still. He knows that if civil litigation is even a remote possibility, a judge could freeze his local assets in an instant. Trevor would not be able to sleep knowing that money was vulnerable. He would want to secure his gala funds and hide the rest. We were banking entirely on his uncontrollable greed and his absolute belief that he was smarter than the banking system. We needed him to panic quietly and move that money out of the state. The waiting was the hardest part. I spent the next 2 days sitting in my quiet apartment, pacing the floor and constantly checking my secure messages with David. Every hour felt like an eternity. I had cut off all contact with my parents and my sister. My extended family was still circulating my mother's vicious rumors that I had suffered a mental breakdown. I was completely isolated, but the isolation was a shield. It kept me focused entirely on the numbers, the strategy, and the trap. I was a corporate auditor hunting a fraudster. Emotion had no place in this process. I treated my own family exactly like a corrupt corporation that needed to be dismantled. On the morning of December 30th, my phone finally rang. It was David. He told me to come to his office immediately. I grabbed my coat and drove downtown, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. When I walked into David's office, he was sitting at his desk with his speakerphone turned on. Sitting next to him was a thick file folder containing all the evidence I had gathered. The forged loan documents, the property records, the audio recording of Trevor's blackmail attempt, and my meticulous audit of Harrison Development. We had not kept this information to ourselves. 24 hours earlier, David had quietly delivered the entire dossier directly to the senior vice president of the internal fraud division at the bank that issued the home equity line of credit. The bank had immediately recognized the massive liability. They had seen the flawless forgery. They had listened to Trevor explicitly admit to the crime on tape. They knew the $400,000 loan was entirely fraudulent, but at David's strict instruction, they had not frozen the account yet. They had placed a silent monitor on the funds. They were waiting in the shadows, right alongside us, watching the money. On the speakerphone, I heard the calm professional voice of the bank's regional fraud investigator. His name was Agent Miller. He informed us that he was currently looking at the live transaction dashboard for the shell account controlled by Harrison Development. I sat down slowly in the leather chair across from David. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I asked Agent Miller if Trevor had taken the bait. Agent Miller's voice crackled slightly through the speaker. He confirmed that less than 10 minutes ago, an authorized user operating from an IP address registered to Trevor Harrison's home network had logged into the commercial banking portal. The user had bypassed the standard daily transfer limits using an executive override code. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair. My mother and my father were probably sitting in the next room while Trevor sat at his computer, executing the final step of his own destruction. They probably thought he was paying the caterers for the upcoming New Year's Eve party. They had no idea they were sitting inside a burning house. Agent Miller continued his report. He stated that Trevor had just initiated a massive wire transfer. He was attempting to move exactly $200,000 out of the local commercial account. David leaned forward, his eyes locked sharply onto the speakerphone. He asked where the money was being routed. This was the absolute critical moment. If Trevor simply moved the money to another local bank, it was still just local fraud. It would remain a messy state-level civil dispute. We needed him to cross the line. Agent Miller paused for a moment, reading the routing numbers on his screen. He then announced that the funds were not staying local. Trevor had initiated an international wire transfer. I was attempting to route the $200,000 through a secondary processing bank in Delaware and ultimately deposit the funds into an offshore corporate holding account registered in the Cayman Islands. He was trying to completely shield the stolen money from any potential United States civil litigation. A deep, heavy silence fell over the law office. David looked at me, and a slow, sharp smile spread across his face. Trevor had actually done it. He had taken the bait. He had let his massive ego and his desperate greed convince him that he could simply hide the stolen equity of my grandfather's property in an offshore account before our supposed January 2nd family mediation. By clicking that transfer button and routing stolen funds through servers in Delaware and out to the Cayman Islands, Trevor Harrison had just elevated his crime. This was no longer just a forged signature on a local property deed. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a home equity line of credit. The exact second that digital currency attempted to cross state and international borders using telecommunications networks, it officially became federal wire fraud. It was a massive felony carrying severe mandatory prison sentences. Agent Miller spoke again, breaking the silence. He informed us that per their internal security protocols and the overwhelming evidence of forgery already provided, the bank's automated fraud defense system had instantly flagged the international wire transfer. The transaction was completely blocked. The $200,000 never left the local account. It was caught in a digital net before it could even reach the secondary processing bank. Furthermore, Agent Miller added his voice, turning completely authoritative. The bank had just triggered an immediate hard freeze on every single account associated with Harrison Development. They had frozen Trevor's personal checking accounts. They had frozen his business credit lines. They had frozen the original $400,000 loan balance. Trevor Harrison could not move a single penny. He could not buy a cup of coffee. He could not pay his electric bill. And he absolutely could not pay the massive venue and catering deposits required for his lavish New Year's Eve investor gala. The trap had violently snapped shut. David thanked Agent Miller and ended the call. The dial tone echoed in the quiet office. David looked at me and stated that the bank was legally obligated to report an attempted international wire fraud of this magnitude directly to the federal authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would be handed the entire dossier by the end of the business day. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute magnitude of what we had just accomplished. For 31 years, my family had forced me to live in a constant state of anxiety. They had manipulated me, used me, and ultimately tried to completely destroy my financial future just to maintain their country club facade. They thought I was a weak, invisible daughter who would quietly accept being robbed. They were about to experience a level of destruction they could never have imagined. Trevor was completely locked out of his stolen money. His fake empire was entirely frozen. The New Year's Eve gala, the event that was supposed to save his reputation, was going to be a spectacular public humiliation. And the federal authorities were currently reading a detailed audit of his crimes. The smear campaign my mother had launched to call me insane was completely useless against federal banking logs. I looked out the large window at the city skyline. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I felt the pure, clean satisfaction of justice. The financial execution of Trevor Harrison and my abusive parents was officially underway, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The final day of the year arrived with a bitter, freezing wind that swept through the city streets. It was December 31st. Tonight was the night Trevor Harrison planned to save his completely fraudulent empire. I sat in my quiet apartment, looking out the window as the sun began to set. For my entire life, New Year's Eve was just another night I spent cleaning up after my family. I would usually be at my parents' house washing dishes while they went out to expensive restaurants and exclusive parties. They would tell me I was too socially awkward to attend these events. They would say my plain clothes would embarrass them in front of their wealthy friends. But tonight I was not staying home. Tonight I was stepping directly into the center of their grand illusion. Trevor had rented the grand ballroom at the most luxurious downtown hotel in the city. It was an iconic building known for hosting elite political fundraisers and massive corporate galas. I knew exactly how much the deposit for that ballroom cost because I had audited his bank records. I knew he had completely drained his last remaining lines of credit just to secure the venue. How was banking his entire future on this one single night? He desperately needed to impress the room full of wealthy real estate investors and local politicians. If he could convince them he was a highly successful developer, he could secure millions in new funding. He would use their new money to pay off his massive hidden debts and keep his fake wealthy lifestyle afloat for another year. It was a classic Ponzi scheme wrapped in expensive silk and false promises. What Trevor did not know was that his accounts were still completely frozen. The $200,000 he had attempted to wire to the Cayman Islands was sitting locked in a federal holding pattern. He had no access to the stolen money. He was hosting a $1 million party with absolutely zero safety net beneath him. He was standing on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. I arrived at the downtown hotel exactly at 8 o'clock. The valet parking line was filled with luxury sports cars and imported sedans. I stepped out of my vehicle and felt the sharp winter air against my skin. I did not look like Clara, the invisible, clumsy daughter. I did not look like the exhausted family servant who was forced to wear cheap, oversized sweaters to avoid outshining her sister. I had spent the afternoon transforming myself into the successful senior corporate auditor that I truly was. I wore a stunning floor-length tailored evening gown in a deep emerald green. The fabric fell perfectly around me, projecting pure, absolute confidence. My hair was styled elegantly, and I wore a simple but beautiful diamond necklace I had purchased for myself years ago, but was never allowed to wear around my mother. I looked like a woman who belonged in the highest circles of corporate finance. I looked like a woman who held absolute power. I walked into the massive grand lobby of the hotel. The floors were polished marble, and towering floral arrangements sat on mahogany tables. I spotted David Caldwell waiting for me near the grand staircase. He looked incredibly distinguished in a tailored black tuxedo. David was not just my attorney tonight. We had orchestrated a completely brilliant strategy for my entrance. David Caldwell was a highly respected veteran in the corporate world. He personally represented one of the wealthiest private equity investors in the entire state. This specific investor was someone Trevor had been desperately trying to court for over 6 months. Trevor considered this investor his ultimate golden ticket. Tonight, I was not walking into that ballroom as a pathetic, uninvited family member. I was walking through those grand double doors as the official +1 of David Caldwell, the sole gatekeeper to Trevor's financial salvation. David smiled as I approached him. He offered his arm and said I looked absolutely ready to execute a hostile corporate takeover. I took his arm and replied that a takeover implied they had something of value worth taking. We were just here to supervise the demolition. We walked up the sweeping grand staircase toward the main ballroom. I could hear the sounds of a live jazz quartet playing soft, elegant music. The heavy oak doors to the ballroom were wide open. A pair of uniformed event staff stood at the entrance checking names on a digital list. David gave them his name and they immediately smiled, stepping aside to let us enter with the utmost respect. I stepped over the threshold and took in the massive grand illusion Trevor had built. The ballroom was absolutely breathtaking. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung from the high-painted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the entire space. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with expensive champagne and rare caviar. In the center of the room stood an enormous glittering ice sculpture carved into the shape of the city skyline. It was an aggressive, vulgar display of supposed wealth. Every single detail in that room was designed to project absolute financial dominance. But looking at the ice sculpture, all I could see was the $400,000 they had stolen from my grandfather's property. I scanned the crowded room. There were perhaps 200 people in attendance. The men wore expensive custom suits, and the women wore designer gowns. They were the local elite, city council members, wealthy doctors, real estate tycoons, and banking executives. They were completely unaware that the man hosting them was a desperate fraudster teetering on the edge of federal indictment. It did not take long to spot my family. They were standing near the center of the room holding court like royalty. Trevor was holding a crystal glass of champagne. He was laughing loudly at a joke told by a prominent local politician. He looked entirely in his element, playing the role of the charming, successful young mogul. But my trained auditor eyes saw the tiny cracks in his performance. His laughter was slightly too loud. His smile was rigid and strained. He kept checking his expensive gold watch and glancing nervously toward his phone. He knew his bank accounts were frozen. He knew the massive catering bill for tonight was going to bounce tomorrow morning. He was sweating pure terror under his tailored tuxedo. Standing right next to him was my sister Chloe. She looked absolutely radiant in a new red designer dress that probably cost $3,000. She was dripping in diamond jewelry. A heavy diamond necklace rested on her collarbone, and matching diamond earrings sparkled in the chandelier light. I stared at those diamonds. A wave of pure righteous disgust washed over me. I knew exactly how they had paid for those jewels. They had used the money they drained from my parents' retirement accounts. They had used the funds they stole from my future. Chloe was literally wearing my stolen inheritance around her neck while smiling and posing for photographs. She looked so proud of herself. She genuinely believed she was superior to everyone in the room simply because she had married a man who knew how to steal. And then there was my mother. Patricia Sterling was standing a few feet away, chatting enthusiastically with the wives of 2 major investors. Patricia wore a dark purple velvet gown and a thick strand of pearls. She was practically vibrating with absolute joy. This was her ultimate dream. She had finally achieved the high society status she had desperately craved her entire life. She was the respected mother-in-law of a brilliant developer. She was hosting the most exclusive gala in the city. She had spent the last 4 days calling every single person she knew, completely destroying my reputation and branding me as a hysterical lunatic, just to ensure this perfect night went undisturbed. She thought she had completely eliminated me from the picture. David leaned in close to me. He whispered that it was time to let them know the ghost had arrived to haunt their party. We began to walk slowly through the crowded ballroom. We did not rush. We moved with the slow, deliberate pace of apex predators circling their trapped prey. People naturally stepped aside to let David through, recognizing his significant status in the corporate world. I kept my head held incredibly high. I felt the gaze of several guests turn toward me. I knew I looked completely different. The posture of the beaten-down daughter was entirely gone. I projected the fierce, unyielding authority of a woman who held absolute total control over the room. We walked directly toward the center of the ballroom where my family was standing. Patricia was the very first one to notice us. She was in the middle of telling a story to a politician's wife when her eyes suddenly drifted past the woman's shoulder. I watched her gaze land on David Caldwell first. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in local finance knew David. A massive, eager smile broke across Patricia's face. She thought the powerful attorney had come to bless Trevor's party. She began to step forward, preparing to greet him and introduce herself as the mother of the host. And then her eyes shifted slightly to the left. Her gaze locked directly onto my face. The transition was absolutely spectacular to witness. Patricia's eager smile did not just fade. It instantly shattered into a million terrified pieces. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale white. Her jaw went completely slack, and her mouth hung open in an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. She looked exactly like a woman who had just seen a dead body rise from a grave and walk into her living room. Her hand actually flew up to her chest, clutching her pearls as if her heart had suddenly stopped beating. Chloe noticed her mother's horrified expression. Chloe turned her head, following Patricia's gaze. When Chloe saw me standing there, radiating absolute power in my emerald gown, the crystal champagne flute in her hand tilted dangerously. A splash of expensive champagne spilled over the rim and landed directly onto her new red designer dress. I almost laughed out loud at the pure poetic justice of the moment. Chloe did not even notice the spill. She was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She took a physical step backward, hiding slightly behind Trevor. Trevor was the last to realize what was happening. He turned around annoyed that his wife and his mother-in-law had suddenly stopped paying attention to him. He looked at David Caldwell, and his face lit up with desperate hope. Then he saw me standing with my arm looped through David's arm. Trevor Harrison, the arrogant con artist who had threatened to destroy my life over the telephone, completely froze. His entire body went completely rigid. I saw the exact moment the devastating reality hit him. He saw the senior partner of the most powerful corporate law firm in the city actively escorting the woman he had just committed federal wire fraud against. He saw his absolute worst nightmare walking right up to him in front of 200 wealthy investors. He knew instantly that his fake empire was completely dead. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them. I did not break eye contact. I looked at my mother, whose chest was heaving with panic. I looked at my sister, who was trembling in her stolen diamonds. I looked at Trevor, whose fake smile had melted into a grimace of pure terror. I stood in the absolute center of their grand illusion, completely destroying it with my mere presence. "Good evening, Trevor," I said. My voice was calm, smooth, and completely devoid of any fear. It sounded incredibly loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over their group. "I told you I was not blind, and the new year has not even started yet." The music from the jazz quartet seemed to fade completely into the background. The low hum of the wealthy crowd mingling around us became a distant, meaningless noise. In that small circle of space, the tension was so incredibly thick, it felt like physical pressure against my skin. Patricia was staring at me, her eyes wide and frantic. She looked at my elegant emerald gown. She looked at my confident posture. This was a direct contradiction to the pathetic narrative she had been spinning for days. She had told all these wealthy women that I was a hysterical lunatic locked away in a psychiatric facility. Now here I was standing poised and powerful on the arm of a highly respected corporate titan. Patricia's entire social foundation was cracking beneath her designer heels. Trevor swallowed hard. I watched his Adam's apple bob nervously against his stiff white collar. He tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him on the first attempt. He cleared his throat desperately, trying to project his fake alpha male persona in front of the surrounding investors. "Clara," he finally managed to say, his voice tight and incredibly strained. "What are you doing here? This is an exclusive private corporate event. You are not on the guest list. You need to leave immediately before I call hotel security and have you forcibly removed for trespassing." He tried to sound authoritative, but the slight tremble in his hand completely betrayed him. He was terrified. He wanted me out of his sight before I could speak another word. He was hoping to intimidate me one last time, relying on his old tactics of bullying the quiet sister. David Caldwell stepped slightly forward, smoothly placing himself between Trevor and me. David did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, lethal calm of a man who held every single winning card in the deck. "Mr. Harrison," David said, smiling a cold, professional smile. "I believe there has been a slight misunderstanding. Clara is not trespassing. She's my personal invited guest this evening. As the legal representative for the Sterling Equity Group, I was sent an exclusive VIP invitation to your gala. I am sure you recognize the firm. We are the exact investors you have been calling 6 times a day for the past month, begging for a capital injection to save your stalled downtown construction projects." Trevor's face transitioned from pale white to a sickly shade of gray. The Sterling Equity Group was the massive private equity firm David represented. They were the whales Trevor desperately needed to survive. Hearing David verbally acknowledge Trevor's desperate financial state in front of the other guests was a brutal, calculated strike. Several nearby investors actually turned their heads, listening closely to the sudden shift in tone. "I thought it would be highly beneficial for us to attend tonight." David continued, his voice smooth as silk. "Clara is a senior corporate auditor. She possesses a uniquely brilliant mind for financial analysis. In fact, she recently completed a highly detailed independent audit of your entire corporate portfolio, Trevor. Her findings were absolutely fascinating. We simply had to come tonight to see the man behind the math in person." My mother, Patricia, finally found her voice. She stepped forward, trying to block David from speaking any further. Her face was twisted into a mask of desperate panic. "David, please," she stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "You do not understand. My daughter Clara is very unwell. She has been suffering from a terrible mental crisis. She is completely confused and having paranoid delusions. You cannot possibly believe a single word she says about Trevor's business. She is just trying to cause drama because she's jealous of her sister. Please, you have to excuse her behavior." I looked at Patricia with absolute zero emotion. She was still trying to play the victim card. She was still trying to weaponize her fake maternal concern to discredit me. But her words sounded incredibly hollow and pathetic in the face of my calm reality. David looked down at Patricia with a gaze so incredibly sharp it could cut through solid steel. "Mrs. Sterling," David said, his tone dropping 10 degrees. "I have been practicing corporate law for 40 years. I know exactly what a mental crisis looks like. I also know exactly what a forged home equity line of credit document looks like. I know what a digital log of an attempted offshore wire transfer looks like. And I know exactly what it sounds like when a desperate man leaves a recorded voicemail threatening to destroy a licensed financial professional. Clara is not the one suffering from delusions tonight. She is the only person in this room firmly grounded in absolute reality." Patricia physically recoiled as if David had just struck her across the face. The mention of the forged documents and the offshore wire transfer completely shattered her last remaining defense. She knew we had the evidence. She knew the federal crime had been fully documented. She looked at Trevor, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Trevor looked like he was going to be physically sick. He looked desperately around the ballroom. The wealthy investors he had spent weeks courting were now staring at him with suspicious, narrowed eyes. The grand illusion was rapidly collapsing around him. The crystal chandeliers, the ice sculpture, the expensive champagne, it all suddenly felt like a massive, elaborate crime scene waiting to be cordoned off. Chloe suddenly burst into tears. Real, ugly, terrified tears. She grabbed Trevor's arm, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly against his watch. "Trevor, tell them, it is not true," Chloe cried, her voice echoing shrilly over the soft jazz music. "Tell them you did not steal her money. Tell them we are not going to lose everything." Trevor did not answer his wife. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of absolute hatred and pure, paralyzing fear. He finally understood that the quiet, obedient sister he had mocked and abused for years had meticulously engineered his complete and total destruction. I looked at the 3 of them standing there, completely broken and humiliated in the center of their own fake kingdom. I did not feel an ounce of pity. They had earned every single second of this terror. I turned slightly toward David. "I think we have seen enough of the illusion, David," I said, my voice carrying clearly to the surrounding guests. "Let us leave them to enjoy their final celebration. I am sure the federal investigators will be arriving very shortly to collect the remaining evidence." I turned my back on my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. I placed my hand on David's arm, and we began to walk slowly back toward the grand ballroom doors. Behind me, I could hear the desperate, panicked whispers of the investors rapidly backing away from Trevor Harrison. The party was officially over, and the reckoning had finally arrived. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the exit when my mother suddenly blocked our path. Patricia Sterling moved with a terrifying speed for a woman wearing a heavy velvet gown and high heels. She intercepted David and me right next to a towering floral arrangement of white roses. To anyone standing more than 5 feet away, she looked like a gracious hostess checking on her guests. She plastered a wide, perfectly straight smile across her face, showcasing her expensive dental work. But up close, her eyes were completely wild, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. "Clara," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with absolute venom. "What exactly do you think you are doing here? You need to turn around and walk out those doors this very second." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I simply smiled back at her with a calm, empty expression. "I am attending a corporate event, Mother," I said. "I was invited." "You are trespassing," Patricia spat her fake smile, never wavering for the benefit of the watching crowd. "You are mentally unstable, and you are causing a scene. If you do not leave right now, I am going to call the hotel security and have you dragged out of this ballroom in handcuffs. Do you want to be humiliated in front of all these important people? Do you want to destroy your sister's special night?" She reached out and clamped her fingers around my forearm. Her acrylic nails dug sharply into my skin through the fabric of my dress. It was the exact same grip she used to use when I was a child, and she wanted to drag me out of a room for speaking out of turn. But I was not a child anymore. I firmly reached over with my free hand and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, until she actually had to tilt her head back to look at me. "You are not in charge of me anymore," I whispered, my voice colder than the ice sculpture in the center of the room. "You do not get to dictate where I go or who I speak to. And if you ever touch me again, Patricia, I will make sure the police know exactly who facilitated a $400,000 federal wire fraud." My mother gasped softly, taking a stumbling step backward. She looked like she had just been slapped. Before she could muster another lie, Trevor suddenly appeared right beside her. Trevor Harrison was a tall man who played college football, and he loved to use his physical size to intimidate people. He stepped directly into my path, towering over me. His face was flushed a dark, angry red, and the veins in his neck were visibly pulsing above his tight tuxedo collar. He completely ignored David Caldwell, standing right next to me, and focused all his desperate rage onto me. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little snitch," Trevor growled, his voice vibrating with a barely contained fury. "I do not care who brought you here. I do not care what kind of fake evidence you think you have. This is my night. I built this company. I invited these investors. You are not going to ruin my life just because you are jealous of Chloe." I took another step forward, deliberately crowding me, trying to force me to back away submissively. I stood my ground. My heels were planted firmly on the marble floor. I looked straight up into his bloodshot eyes. "You built absolutely nothing, Trevor," I said, my voice projecting a steady, lethal calm. "You leased a lifestyle you could not afford, and you stole from your own family to pay the bills. You are a complete fraud." Trevor leaned his head down until his face was inches from mine. I could smell the sharp tang of expensive whiskey and stale sweat rolling off his skin. "I am going to destroy you, Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling with malice. "I am going to make one phone call tomorrow morning, and your auditing career will be completely over. You will be blacklisted in this city. I will personally make sure you lose your apartment, your job, and every single dollar to your name. Now get out of my ballroom before I throw you out myself." He raised his hand as if he was actually going to grab my shoulder and physically push me toward the exit. But before his fingers could even graze my dress, David Caldwell stepped smoothly between us. David did not look intimidated. He looked mildly amused, like a lion watching a mouse throw a temper tantrum. "I strongly advise against touching my guest, Mr. Harrison," David said, his tone perfectly polite, but carrying a dangerous edge. "Physical assault in front of 200 witnesses would not look very good for your corporate image. Especially tonight." Trevor froze his hand, hovering in mid-air. He glared at David, his chest heaving as he tried to mentally calculate his next move. He was trapped. He could not yell at David Caldwell because David represented the exact private equity money Trevor desperately needed to avoid bankruptcy. Trevor slowly lowered his hand, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "Fine," Trevor spat, straightening his jacket and trying to regain some fraction of his sophisticated alpha male posture. You can stay and watch me secure the biggest financial deal of my entire life. You can watch me win, Clara, but tomorrow morning you are completely finished." Trevor turned his back on us and stalked back toward Chloe, who was still standing near the dessert table, dabbing her tear-stained eyes with a cocktail napkin. Patricia shot me one final look of pure, absolute hatred before hurrying after her son-in-law. David turned to me and offered a small nod of respect. "You handled that beautifully, Clara," he said quietly. "Now we just wait for the main event." We did not have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, the soft jazz music suddenly stopped. A sharp, clear, ringing sound echoed through the grand ballroom as someone tapped a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low murmur of wealthy conversation immediately died down. 200 guests turned their attention toward the small elevated stage at the far end of the room. Standing at the microphone was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccable black tuxedo. It was Arthur Vance. He was the head of the Sterling Equity Group. He was David Caldwell's primary client, and he was the absolute wealthiest, most influential real estate investor in the entire state. Arthur Vance was the man Trevor had been aggressively courting for months. How was the golden goose? I looked over at Trevor. The angry red flush had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a massive, eager smile. He wrapped his arm around Chloe's waist and puffed out his chest. Patricia clapped her hands together in silent delight. They all thought Arthur Vance was about to deliver a glowing endorsement of Harrison Development. They thought he was going to publicly announce a multi-million-dollar partnership. They thought they had finally secured their salvation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur Vance began, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent ballroom. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight on the eve of a new year. We are here to talk about the future of commercial real estate in our beautiful city. We are here to talk about vision, progress, and most importantly, integrity." Trevor nodded enthusiastically, raising his champagne glass slightly in agreement. He looked around the room, soaking in the attention. He was completely blind to the executioner standing on the stage. "In my 40 years of investing in corporate development," Arthur Vance continued, his tone remaining even and professional, "I have always operated under one strict principle. Trust is the absolute foundation of any financial partnership. When we invest millions of dollars into a project, we are not just investing in brick and mortar. We are investing in the character and the honesty of the people running the operation." Arthur Vance paused. He looked down at a small index card resting on the podium. When he looked back up, his expression had shifted from polite charm to a cold, hardened steel. "Over the past several weeks, my firm has been engaged in serious discussions with Trevor Harrison regarding a major capital injection for Harrison Development," Arthur announced. Trevor puffed his chest out even further, a smug grin spreading across his face. "However," Arthur continued, his voice suddenly dropping into a sharp clinical register, "a standard condition of our investment process involves a rigorous independent audit of all related corporate assets and liabilities." The smile on Trevor's face instantly faltered. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting toward David Caldwell and then toward me. The reality of my presence was finally beginning to penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. "I believe in transparency," Arthur Vance said, his voice echoing loudly over the sound system. "And tonight, transparency is required. I must inform this room that during our mandatory due diligence process, my legal and financial team uncovered severe, alarming irregularities within the Harrison Development portfolio." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. 200 wealthy investors, city officials, and socialites suddenly shifted their gaze directly onto Trevor. The room felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out through the ventilation system. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Chloe dropped her champagne flute entirely. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody even looked down. "We have identified massive undisclosed debts." Arthur continued, methodically listing the crimes like a judge reading a verdict. "We have discovered multiple stalled projects, hidden behind falsified progress reports. We have found millions of dollars in unpaid contractor invoices that were deliberately omitted from the official corporate ledgers. And most concerning of all, we have been made aware of a highly credible ongoing investigation involving federal wire fraud and the illegal misappropriation of private assets to artificially inflate the company's liquidity." The absolute silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath from the surrounding guests as they physically backed away from Trevor and my family. They were creating a wide, empty circle of social isolation right in the middle of the crowded ballroom. Trevor was completely exposed. I was standing completely alone under the bright chandelier lights, stripped of all his fake wealth and false promises. Therefore, Arthur Vance stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Sterling Equity Group is formally withdrawing all funding considerations for Harrison Development, effective immediately. We will not be moving forward with any partnerships. Furthermore, we have forwarded our complete audit findings to the appropriate state and federal regulatory authorities for further review. I advise everyone in this room to carefully examine their own financial ties to this organization. Thank you and good evening. Arthur Vance stepped away from the microphone and calmly walked down the stage stairs. He did not look back. The grand illusion was officially dead. Trevor Harrison was publicly ruined. His reputation was completely obliterated in front of every single person who mattered in his industry. He stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, staring at the empty stage, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He turned his head slowly and met my gaze across the room. He finally understood the absolute devastating power of the quiet sister he had so casually abused. He had threatened to destroy my career, but I had just burned his entire life to the ground without raising my voice a single decibel. I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold. I did not feel bad for him. I did not feel bad for my mother or my sister. They had built their entire existence on lies, manipulation, and theft. I had simply turned on the lights and let the world see exactly what they truly were. This was not just revenge. This was absolute corporate justice. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom had barely closed behind Arthur Vance when the total reality of his departure settled over the crowd. The absolute silence that followed his speech was suffocating. 200 of the most elite real estate investors, politicians, and socialites in the city stood completely frozen. They held their expensive crystal champagne flutes suspended in midair. No one dared to take a single sip. No one dared to whisper a single word. They simply stared at the empty stage and then slowly turned their collective gaze toward the man who had invited them to this lavish charade. Trevor Harrison looked like a man who had just been struck by a high-speed train, but was somehow miraculously still standing on his feet. His custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly seemed entirely too large for his rapidly deflating frame. His jaw opened and closed as he desperately tried to find any possible words to salvage his burning empire. He looked at the exit where Arthur Vance had disappeared. He looked at my mother, who was clutching her throat in absolute terror. And finally, he looked directly at me. I did not wait for him to catch his breath. I did not wait for my mother to attempt another desperate lie to save her precious social standing. I released my firm grip on David Caldwell's arm and began to walk deliberately toward the stage. My emerald green evening gown brushed softly against the polished marble floor. Every single eye in that massive grand ballroom tracked my movement. The crowd of wealthy guests naturally parted for me just as they had for Arthur Vance. They saw a woman walking with the precise, calculated posture of an executioner. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the small stage and stepped directly behind the microphone. I placed my hands flat on the cold edges of the wooden podium. The wood felt solid and grounding beneath my palms. I looked out over the sea of designer dresses and custom suits. I saw my mother, Patricia, pressing her hand against her chest as if her heart was attempting to forcefully escape her ribcage. I saw my sister Chloe staring at me with wide, uncomprehending, terrified eyes. I saw Trevor standing utterly paralyzed. "My name is Clara Sterling," I said. My voice echoed loudly through the high-painted ceilings of the grand ballroom. It was completely steady. There was absolutely no anger in my tone. There was no hysterical shouting. I spoke with the exact cold factual precision I used when delivering a multi-million-dollar audit report to a hostile board of directors. I am a senior corporate auditor. I am also the sister-in-law of your host this evening, Trevor Harrison. A low, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd of investors, but I did not pause to let them gossip. I simply raised my voice slightly, cutting through the ambient noise with absolute unwavering authority. Trevor invited all of you here tonight to celebrate his supposed massive success in the commercial real estate market, I continued. He wanted to deeply impress you with this grand ballroom, this premium vintage champagne, and that massive ice sculpture sitting in the center of the room. I wanted you to believe he is a man of immense wealth and limitless potential so that you would blindly hand him your private investment capital. But Trevor Harrison is completely, utterly bankrupt. The collective gasp from the crowd was loud and undeniable. Several prominent city council members actually took rapid physical steps backward, putting immediate distance between themselves and Trevor. I am not speaking in vague metaphors, I stated, looking directly into the crowd of elites. Trevor Harrison currently has multiple unpaid state tax liens. His active construction projects have been completely stalled for over 14 months due to severely delinquent contractor invoices. Every single corporate credit line attached to Harrison Development is completely exhausted. He's drowning in millions of dollars of actively hidden debt. He did not have a single legitimate dollar to his name to pay for this extravagant party tonight. So he decided to steal it from his own family. "Clara, shut your mouth!" Trevor suddenly roared. His voice cracked with a pathetic, desperate edge. He took a heavy, stumbling step toward the stage. "She is lying," he screamed, turning his panicked face toward the wealthy investors surrounding him. "She is completely insane. She has been having a severe mental breakdown all week. Do not listen to a single word she says." Patricia, tell them. "Tell them your daughter is sick." He pointed a shaking, sweating finger at my mother. The entire room instantly turned to look at Patricia Sterling. This was the exact moment she had prepared for. This was the specific scenario she had spent 4 days trying to engineer by aggressively calling every aunt, cousin, and church member she knew. She was supposed to confidently step forward and play the tragic, heartbroken mother, publicly confirming that I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. But Patricia could not speak. She looked up at me, standing on that stage, radiating absolute, undeniable truth, and her throat completely closed. She saw David Caldwell standing near the front row, watching her with lethal professional intent. She knew the hard evidence was entirely real. She opened her mouth to defend Trevor, but only a weak, pathetic wheezing sound emerged. She physically shrank back into the crowd, completely abandoning her golden son-in-law to the wolves. Trevor looked at Patricia in absolute horror. He realized in that agonizing fraction of a second that nobody was going to save his life. "No one is lying, Trevor," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling volume that forced the entire room to lean forward and listen. 3 weeks ago, Trevor Harrison and my parents actively conspired to commit massive mortgage fraud. They took the original property deed and the legal trust documents for a private residence that I own outright. It is a modest cabin legally left to me by my grandfather. Without my knowledge or my consent, Trevor used my pristine credit score to formally apply for a $400,000 home equity line of credit. They hired a corrupt local notary. They spent hours meticulously practicing my signature until they could produce a flawless forgery. And then they directed the commercial bank to wire the entire $400,000 directly into a corporate shell account solely registered to Harrison Development. I watched the blood completely drain from Chloe's face. My sister looked down in horror at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The terrifying realization finally hit her limited understanding. She was literally wearing the proceeds of a massive felony around her neck. That stolen money was specifically used to pay the massive deposit for this exact ballroom, I continued, gesturing toward the sparkling crystal chandeliers above us. You are all currently drinking expensive champagne bought with my stolen equity. You are standing directly inside an active financial crime scene. You have absolutely no proof, Trevor shouted, his voice echoing with sheer hysterical terror. You cannot prove a single thing. It is your word against mine. I smiled down at him. It was a terrifying smile because it contained absolutely zero warmth. I do not need to prove the forgery, Trevor, I said calmly, because your own desperate, unyielding greed proved it for me. The entire grand ballroom was completely mesmerized. Even the professional waitstaff had stopped moving. When you steal $400,000 from a licensed corporate auditor, you should probably expect them to thoroughly audit your life, I explained, my voice echoing flawlessly across the silent room. Yesterday, my attorney, David Caldwell, sent you a very polite, very weak legal letter requesting a simple family mediation. We actively wanted you to believe that I was too terrified to go to the police. We wanted you to feel completely untouchable, and you fell for the bait instantly. But you were also deeply scared, Trevor. You knew a formal mediation meant lawyers would eventually look directly at your corporate bank accounts. You knew a civil judge might freeze your local assets. So you decided you needed to quickly hide the stolen money. Trevor's eyes widened to the size of small saucers. His mouth hung completely open. He was visibly shaking now, his expensive tailored tuxedo trembling violently around his broad shoulders. This morning, at exactly 10:14, Trevor logged into his commercial banking portal from his private home network, I announced, projecting every single word with absolute devastating clarity. He deliberately bypassed his daily transfer limits and attempted to wire exactly $200,000 of that stolen equity to an offshore holding account legally located in the Cayman Islands. I wanted to permanently shield the money from any domestic civil litigation. The wealthy real estate investors in the room began murmuring loudly to each other. They understood exactly what an offshore wire transfer meant. They were highly seasoned finance professionals, and they instantly recognized the exact mechanics of a desperate criminal actively trying to flee the jurisdiction. But what Trevor did not know, I continued, my voice rising slightly to deliver the final crushing blow, was that David and I had already delivered the forged loan documents, my complete financial audit of his failing company, and a crystal clear audio recording of Trevor actively trying to blackmail me directly to the internal fraud division of the bank. The bank was constantly watching his account. The exact second Trevor attempted to move that stolen money across international borders, he triggered an automatic federal security block. The money never left the local account. The bank successfully initiated a complete and total hard freeze on every single asset connected to Harrison Development. Trevor let out a strange, guttural choking noise. He took another heavy step backward, bumping roughly into a tall glass cocktail table. A tray of expensive appetizers crashed violently to the marble floor, but nobody even glanced at the mess. "You are completely broke, Trevor," I said, staring directly into his terrified wide eyes. "You do not have a single dollar to pay the remaining catering bill for tonight. But far more importantly, you actively elevated a local civil dispute into a massive federal crime. Attempting to move stolen funds across international lines is federal wire fraud." "Liar," Trevor screamed suddenly, lunging forward like a cornered animal. He completely snapped. His arrogant mind simply could not process the absolute permanent destruction of his entire life. "You arrogant little rat, I'm going to kill you." He charged toward the small stage, his hands curled tightly into violent, aggressive fists. Several men standing in the front row instantly flinched, preparing to physically intervene, but they did not have to move a single muscle. At that exact moment, the massive heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. They hit the marble walls with a deafening crash that echoed loudly like a gunshot. The entire wealthy crowd turned their heads in absolute unison. Walking aggressively through the doors were two large men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across the back. They were accompanied closely by three uniformed local police officers. The federal agents moved with absolute terrifying professional purpose. They did not look up at the crystal chandeliers. They did not look at the wealthy, frightened guests. They walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, their sharp eyes locked entirely on Trevor Harrison. Trevor Harrison, one of the federal agents, called out, his voice carrying the heavy, unquestionable authority of the United States government. Trevor stopped completely dead in his tracks just 10 feet away from the wooden stage. All the violent rage instantly drained out of his body, completely replaced by the paralyzing, terrifying reality of his situation. He looked at the approaching federal agents. He looked back up at me, standing calmly on the stage, and then he slowly, weakly raised his trembling, empty hands into the air. The federal agents reached him in mere seconds. One agent aggressively grabbed Trevor's left arm and spun him completely around, forcing him to directly face the crowd of elite investors he had spent months desperately trying to impress. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing sharply through the completely silent ballroom was the most deeply satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "You are currently under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe identity theft," the agent stated loudly, pulling Trevor's arms tightly and securely behind his back. It was the ultimate, absolute public humiliation. Trevor Harrison, the arrogant man who fiercely prided himself on projecting a flawless image of superior wealth and social dominance, was currently being handcuffed in front of the entire city elite. The wealthy investors he absolutely needed to save his life were actively watching him being aggressively treated like a common street criminal. Prominent city council members were rapidly pulling out their cell phones and recording the humiliating arrest. The grand illusion was not just deeply broken, it was completely pulverized into fine dust. As the agents quickly began reading Trevor his legal Miranda rights, a sudden, sharp, desperate scream pierced the tense air. It was my mother. Patricia Sterling had been watching the horrific scene unfold with wide, unblinking, terrified eyes. When she heard the federal agent loudly read the severe charges, when she heard the physical metallic click of the handcuffs, the sheer overwhelming reality of the disastrous situation finally broke her fragile mind. She realized that her favorite golden successful son-in-law was definitely going to federal prison. She realized her own deep complicity in the mortgage fraud would inevitably be uncovered by the investigators. She realized her highly prized high society reputation was completely, permanently destroyed forever. Patricia let out a high-pitched, agonizing wailing sound. Her eyes physically rolled back into her head and her knees completely, totally buckled. She collapsed directly onto the hard marble floor in a heavy, unmoving pile of dark purple velvet. She had fainted. It was absolutely not a theatrical performance meant for sympathy. It was a genuine, absolute physical collapse, directly brought on by sheer, unadulterated terror. Several wealthy guests rapidly stepped away from her unconscious body, deeply not wanting to be associated with the highly disgraced family. Chloe was standing completely alone near the ruined dessert table. Her husband was actively being marched out the grand doors by federal agents in tight handcuffs. Her mother was completely unconscious on the cold floor. The wealthy socialite friends she had arrogantly bragged to for years were actively avoiding her desperate gaze. Chloe looked down at the massive, expensive diamond necklace heavily resting on her chest. She grabbed the heavy stolen jewels with violently shaking hands and suddenly loudly screamed. She screamed aggressively at Trevor as the agents walked him quickly past her, calling him a miserable liar and a complete failure. She screamed loudly, realizing she was absolutely completely broke and currently married to a convicted federal felon. I stood quietly on the elevated stage, calmly watching the absolute total wreckage of the Sterling family. I felt a profound, deeply settling sense of permanent closure. The quiet, invisible daughter who sadly sat by the drafty kitchen door was completely gone forever. The fragile house of cards had completely violently collapsed, and total justice had been beautifully, cleanly, and permanently served. I stepped down from the wooden stage, fully ready to walk out of that grand ballroom and happily start my brand new life. The passage of 3 months felt like taking a deep, clean breath of fresh air after drowning for 31 years. It was early June, and the summer sun was bright and warm across the city. My life had completely transformed. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was entirely erased from my record without a single penalty. My grandfather's cabin was absolutely safe and securely in my name. I had received a massive promotion at my corporate auditing firm, and my daily routine was filled with genuine, absolute peace. But the reality, for the people who had actively tried to destroy me, was entirely, completely different. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying and absolute precision. Trevor Harrison was immediately denied bail. The federal judge looked at his desperate attempt to wire stolen funds to the Cayman Islands and instantly deemed him a massive flight risk. The charming fake real estate developer was currently sitting in a cold federal holding facility wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was formally indicted on multiple severe counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. His high-priced defense attorneys completely abandoned him the exact second his corporate accounts were permanently frozen. He was assigned a public defender, and he was facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. The local newspapers had an absolute field day with the story. The front page headline read, "Local tycoon exposed as complete fraud." But Trevor was not the only one facing a brutal, permanent reckoning. My parents, Richard and Patricia Sterling, finally learned that actions have severe, inescapable consequences. For years, they had desperately bailed Trevor out of his terrible business decisions. They had secretly taken out massive secondary mortgages on their beautiful colonial home just to keep his fake empire afloat. They completely believed Trevor when he promised to pay them back after his luxurious New Year's Eve gala. But when the federal investigators permanently froze every single asset connected to Harrison Development, my parents' financial lifeline was instantly, completely severed. They could not make their massive monthly mortgage payments. The commercial bank moved with aggressive, unyielding speed. Within 2 months, the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on their grand suburban house. My mother, Patricia, The woman who based her entire existence on projecting absolute wealth and elite high society status was forced to pack up her life in cheap cardboard boxes. The wealthy church friends she had enthusiastically weaponized against me completely abandoned her. Nobody wanted to be publicly associated with a family actively being investigated by the federal government. They lost the house. They lost their luxury cars. My father's retirement accounts were entirely drained. They were forced to rent a tiny rundown two-room apartment on the far industrial side of the city. I heard the pathetic details through David Caldwell, who was keeping a professional eye on the legal fallout. He told me the apartment was drafty and located right above a loud, noisy commercial laundromat. My father, the passive coward who silently watched me get abused, was now spending his day sitting in a cheap chair with absolutely no money and zero legacy. My mother, who used to scream at me for spilling wine on a rug, was now forced to clip paper coupons and shop at discount grocery stores. Their grand illusion had burned completely to the ground, leaving them in absolute total poverty. And then there was my sister Chloe. The undisputed golden child of the Sterling family had lost absolutely everything. The federal agents legally seized all of her expensive diamond jewelry and her entire designer wardrobe because it was all purchased with stolen corporate funds. She went from attending lavish country club luncheons to standing completely alone in the unemployment line. Because Chloe had never bothered to get a college degree or learn a single marketable skill, she had absolutely no options. The woman who used to constantly mock my plain clothes and demand I wait on her hand and foot was forced to take a minimum wage job. She was working the cash register at a cheap retail clothing store in the local shopping mall. She was standing on her feet for 9 hours a day, folding discounted sweaters and dealing with rude, angry customers just to afford her basic daily groceries. The absolute ultimate climax of this entire ordeal happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting comfortably at my desk in my corner office, reviewing a complex quarterly financial report. The afternoon sun was streaming beautifully through the large glass window. My desk phone was quiet, and my coffee was perfectly hot. Suddenly, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the desk. I looked at the glowing screen. It was an unknown local number. I had permanently blocked my parents and my sister months ago. But this was a number I did not recognize at all. I picked up the phone and pressed the green accept button. "Hello," I said, maintaining my calm professional tone. "Clara." The voice on the other end was high-pitched, desperate, and completely broken. It was Chloe. She was sobbing heavily, her breath catching painfully in her throat. "Clara, please do not hang up on me. Please, I am actively begging you. I borrowed a coworker's phone to call you. You have to help me." I leaned back in my comfortable leather office chair. I did not feel a single spike of anxiety. I did not feel any anger. I just felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute calm. I let her speak. Chloe's words tumbled out in a chaotic, panicked rush. "Clara, it is a complete nightmare. Trevor is absolutely going to prison for decades. The federal agents took literally everything. Mom and Dad are living in a horrible, disgusting apartment, and they have zero money to help me. I am working at a terrible retail store. My feet are covered in painful blisters. Customers yell at me all day long. I cannot live like this, Clara. I absolutely cannot do it. I need to divorce Trevor before the government tries to come after my future wages. But I have absolutely zero money to hire a divorce lawyer." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She was waiting for me to jump in and save her. She was waiting for the old Clara to apologize for her pain and immediately offer a massive financial solution. When I remained completely silent, she pushed much harder. "Clara, we are sisters," she cried, her voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. "I know things were bad at Christmas. I know Mom and Dad made some terrible mistakes. But you are rich now. You have your high corporate job and your grandfather's property. You have to help me. I just need a small loan, just $10,000 to hire a decent lawyer. I promise I will absolutely pay you back. Family is supposed to help family, Clara. Please, you cannot just abandon me." I sat in my quiet office and looked out the window at the bright, clear blue sky. I thought about the drafty folding chair by the kitchen door. I thought about the endless, grueling years of carrying their emotional baggage. I thought about the sharp, stinging pain of my mother slapping my face while Chloe performed a theatrical crying routine over a spilled glass of red wine. They had deliberately tried to steal my entire future, and now she was actively begging me to fund her escape from the exact criminal she eagerly chose to marry. "Chloe," I said, My voice was completely steady cold and absolutely devoid of any emotion. It was the exact tone of a judge delivering a final unchangeable sentence. Yes, Clara, she gasped eagerly, clearly thinking I was about to offer her a massive financial lifeline. Thank you so much. I let a full 3 seconds of total heavy silence pass between us. Are you completely blind? I asked, speaking the words slowly and deliberately. You ruined absolutely everything you touched. I did not wait to hear her reaction. I did not wait to hear her scream or cry or violently beg. I simply moved my finger and pressed the red button ending the call forever. I immediately went into my phone settings and permanently blocked that unknown number. I placed the phone back down on my pristine desk. I picked up my pen and went right back to auditing my corporate financial reports. The Sterling family was officially permanently closed for business. Looking back on everything that happened, I completely realize now that the greatest gift my family ever gave me was their absolute, utter betrayal. They thought they were completely destroying me, but they were actually handing me the key to my own permanent cage. I used to think that love meant endless, grueling sacrifice. I used to truly believe that if I just worked hard enough and endured enough pain, my family would eventually see my absolute value. But genuine love is not a transaction, and it is certainly not supposed to be a permanent punishment. If you are watching this video right now, and you are the designated scapegoat of your own family, I deeply want you to listen to me very carefully. You absolutely do not owe your precious peace of mind to people who consistently treat you like a massive burden. Setting strict, permanent boundaries is not an act of vicious revenge. It is an act of absolute survival. You have the complete right to aggressively protect your future, your finances, and your mental health from anyone who tries to tear you down, even if those people share your exact DNA. Family is supposed to be the people who build you up, not the people who actively conspire to steal your joy and your legal identity. You absolutely do not have to sit by the drafty kitchen door anymore. You have the total power to stand up, walk out into the cold air, and build your own incredible life, completely free from their toxic absolute control. It might be totally terrifying at first, but I promise you the absolute silence of your own peaceful home is the most beautiful, rich reward you will ever experience. Thank you so much for staying with me and carefully listening to my story all the way to the very end. I deeply hope my experience gives you the courage to absolutely recognize your own total worth and to permanently cut ties with anyone who refuses to respect you. If this story heavily resonated with you, please hit that like button and actively subscribe to the channel to hear more stories about finding real justice and taking back absolute control of your life. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I read every single comment and I deeply appreciate your total support. Remember, you are incredibly strong, you are deeply valuable, and you absolutely deserve to live a life completely surrounded by genuine love and absolute respect. Take care of yourself and never be afraid to completely walk away from the illusion. I stood on the worn wooden planks of the wraparound porch of my grandfather's house. The early evening sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep violet. A warm summer breeze rustled through the ancient oak trees that lined the long gravel driveway. For the first time in what felt like my entire life, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. I took a deep, long breath of the fresh pine-scented air. I held it in my lungs for a moment, and then I let it out. Along with that breath, I released 31 years of suffocating fear. The heavy iron chain that my family had wrapped around my neck was finally broken. This house, the one my grandfather had built with his own hands and left exclusively to me, was now completely and legally restored to my name. It was no longer a pawn in Trevor Harrison's desperate, fraudulent schemes. It was no longer a target for my mother's boundless greed. The thick stack of legal documents sitting on my kitchen counter proved it. Just yesterday, David Caldwell had handed me the final certified paperwork. The fraudulent $400,000 home equity line of credit had been entirely wiped from the public record. The bank, having recognized their own monumental failure in verifying my forged signature, had formally cleared the debt and issued a profound legal apology. My title was clean, my credit was pristine, my home was truly mine again. I walked over to the wooden rocking chair that my grandfather used to sit in, and I slowly sat down. The wood creaked softly, a familiar and comforting sound that echoed through the quiet evening. I rested my hands on the smooth armrests and simply looked out over the front lawn. The silence was not empty. It was full and rich and incredibly vibrant. There were no cell phones buzzing with angry demands. There were no manipulative text messages from my sister Chloe begging for bailouts. There were no furious screaming matches from my mother Patricia telling me I was a worthless embarrassment. There was only the gentle sound of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. People often ask me if I feel any guilt. They assume that walking away from your own biological family must leave a terrible bleeding wound in your heart. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water and that you must always forgive the people who raised you, no matter how terribly they treat you. I spent decades deeply internalizing that exact toxic message. I spent my entire youth and my early adulthood desperately trying to earn the love of a mother who saw me only as a prop and a father who saw me only as a convenience. I twisted myself into knots trying to be the perfect invisible peacekeeper so that my sister could shine in her golden spotlight. But as I sit here on this porch, I can honestly say that I do not feel a single drop of guilt. I search my heart for regret, and I find absolutely nothing but an immense, profound, and quiet peace. Guilt is an emotion reserved for those who have done something wrong. I did nothing wrong. I simply stopped allowing myself to be destroyed. I stopped setting myself on fire just to keep them warm. When I finally walked away and let their massive house of cards collapse, I did not cause their ruin. I simply refused to be the foundation that held up their lies anymore. Their destruction was the direct and unavoidable consequence of their own malicious actions. The sheer level of peace I feel today is almost overwhelming. It is the peace of knowing that my bank accounts are safe. It is the peace of waking up on a Saturday morning and knowing that my time belongs entirely to me. I no longer have to spend my weekends auditing Trevor's chaotic business ledgers for free. I no longer have to endure my mother's vicious insults about my clothes or my career or my personality. I no longer have to act as the emotional sponge for a family of relentless narcissists. The only person I am responsible for now is myself, and that realization is the most intoxicating freedom I have ever experienced. When I reflect on the intense psychological dynamics of my family, I realize just how insidious familial abuse truly is. It does not always happen with physical violence or loud dramatic explosions. Sometimes it happens quietly and methodically over decades. It happens when you are a child and your parents slowly condition you to believe that your feelings do not matter. It happens when they assign you the permanent role of the family scapegoat. They project all of their own failures, insecurities, and ugly behaviors onto you. They convince the world that you are the difficult one, the unstable one, the one who causes all the problems. And because you are a child who relies on them for survival, you actually believe their narrative. You grow up thinking that you must somehow be fundamentally flawed. You think that if you just work harder, achieve more, or become completely invisible, they will finally look at you with pride. But a toxic family system requires a punching bag to function. They need someone to carry the blame, so they never have to look in the mirror and face their own horrible reflections. My mother needed me to be the awkward failure, so she could pretend she was a perfect parent to my beautiful, flawless sister. Trevor needed me to be a weak, passive victim, so he could easily steal my financial assets without fear of retaliation. Blood does not give anyone the basic human right to use you as a financial or emotional punching bag. Having shared DNA does not constitute a blank check for continuous lifelong abuse. We excuse behavior from family members that we would never in a million years tolerate from a friend, a romantic partner, or a colleague. If a stranger walked up to you and forged your signature to steal $400,000, you would call the police immediately. But when a family member does it, there is a sudden immense pressure to handle it quietly, to protect the family name, and to sweep the felony completely under the rug. I refuse to participate in that dangerous delusion any longer. I refuse to accept the premise that family loyalty requires complete self-destruction. Setting strict boundaries with the people who hurt you is not a cruel or vindictive act. It is a fundamental act of pure survival. It is the necessary surgical removal of a cancer that is actively trying to kill your spirit. When you draw a hard, solid line and tell toxic people they can no longer have access to your life, you are not punishing them. You are simply protecting yourself. For 31 years, I allowed myself to be manipulated and controlled. I let their constant gaslighting make me doubt my own sanity. When my mother launched her vicious smear campaign to convince our entire extended family that I was having a mental breakdown, I almost let it break me. I almost believed that I was the crazy one for wanting to defend my own property, but I found my voice. I leaned into my professional skills, my logic, and my unwavering commitment to the absolute truth. I used the exact same meticulous auditing skills I use in the corporate world to systematically dismantle their lies and expose their massive fraud. Now my mother and father are living in a tiny rundown apartment, learning what it feels like to have absolutely nothing. My sister is working a minimum wage retail job, realizing that her stolen diamonds could not buy her a happy or secure future. And Trevor Harrison is sitting in a federal holding facility, facing decades in prison for his own arrogant, unyielding greed. I did not force them to make those terrible choices. I merely stopped shielding them from the consequences. My mornings used to begin with a sharp jolt of panic, wondering what crisis I would be forced to solve that day. Now I wake up to the soft, natural light filtering through the vintage lace curtains of my bedroom window. I walk down to my spacious country kitchen and brew a fresh pot of rich, dark coffee. I sit at the heavy oak dining table and read the morning news without any interruptions. There are no frantic phone calls demanding my immediate compliance. There are no passive-aggressive text messages intended to ruin my mood. The profound silence of my home is a daily luxury that I will never ever take for granted. I spend my weekends tending to the large garden in the backyard, planting vibrant flowers and growing fresh vegetables. The simple physical act of nurturing life in the soil feels incredibly healing. It is a stark contrast to the sterile artificial world of country club galas and fake socialite posturing that my mother and sister desperately clung to. I have also learned the incredible value of deep psychological therapy. In the months following the explosive confrontation at the New Year's Eve gala, I sought out a professional counselor who specializes in narcissistic family abuse. Working through the complex layered trauma of my childhood has been a profound revelation. I learned how to identify the specific manipulative tactics my family used to keep me compliant. I learned about trauma bonding and the intense fear, obligation, and guilt that toxic parents used to control their adult children. Therapy provided me with the vital emotional tools to completely deconstruct the false narrative I had been fed my entire life. I finally understood that I was never the problem. I was simply the convenient emotional dumping ground for a group of deeply broken, profoundly insecure individuals. This process of healing has allowed me to discover who Clara Sterling truly is beneath all the heavy armor. I am a woman who loves quiet evenings reading historical biographies. I am a woman who enjoys taking long, challenging hikes through the nearby state parks, feeling the burn in my muscles and the fresh air in my lungs. I am a woman who is fiercely intelligent, fiercely capable, and fiercely independent. I no longer feel the need to hide my intelligence to make others feel superior. I no longer diminish my accomplishments to avoid triggering my sister's raging jealousy. I stand tall in my own authentic power. The legacy of my grandfather lives on, not just in the wooden beams and brick foundation of this house, but in the unwavering strength he passed down to me. He was a man of immense integrity and quiet dignity. He worked incredibly hard to build a secure life, and he valued honesty above all else. By exposing Trevor Harrison and dismantling my family's fraudulent schemes, I have actively protected that powerful legacy. I have ensured that the Sterling name, at least my version of it, stands for truth, accountability, and absolute justice. As the sun finally sets, completely casting the world into a soft, calming twilight, I realize that my story is not a tragedy. It is a story of profound, magnificent triumph. It is a story about the absolute power of standing in your own truth, even when your voice shakes and the entire world seems stacked against you. It is a testament to the undeniable fact that no matter how deep the manipulation goes, no matter how flawless the forgery appears, the truth always leaves a permanent, unerasable paper trail. I hope that by sharing my journey, I can shine a bright, guiding light for others who are currently trapped in the dark, suffocating grip of family abuse. I want you to look at my life and see the undeniable proof that escape is entirely possible. You do not have to accept the terrible role you were assigned at birth. You do not have to sacrifice your financial stability, your mental health, or your precious future on the altar of toxic family loyalty. You have the absolute right to demand respect, to protect your assets, and to relentlessly pursue your own individual happiness. If you are currently sitting in the dark, wondering if you have the strength to break the chains, I am here to tell you that you are infinitely stronger than you think. The very fact that you recognize the dysfunction is the first massive step toward your ultimate freedom. Trust your instincts, document the abuse, gather your evidence, build a solid, impenetrable exit strategy. And when the perfect moment arrives, do not hesitate to walk away and never look back. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your sanity and your future, you are not alone. There is a massive global community of strong, resilient survivors who have walked this exact same painful path and emerged victorious on the other side. Please hit that like button and subscribe to support this channel so we can continue to share these vital stories of justice and empowerment. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Have you ever had to draw a hard, solid line with your own family? Let me know below in the comments section. I read every single message, and I am constantly inspired by your incredible bravery and shared strength. Until next time, remember this most important lesson: you write your own story.